Um, so thank you everyone for joining us and welcome to our fourth and final climate change roundtable event. As many of you know by now, my name is Harriet O'Neill and I'm Assistant Director for the Fine Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at the British School at Rome. It has been an absolute pleasure to co-organise the roundtables with Florian Mussgnug as part of the UCL Cities Partnership Scheme and Professor Chris Wickham, who's Director of the BSR, under the auspices of the British Embassy in Rome as part of the pre-COP activity taking place in Italy. As you would have been able to see on our website, the general heading for this series of workshops is Sustainability as Cultural Practice, Verbal and Visual Art, History and the Environmental Humanities. And our intention when we were planning this in January was to explore how research and creative critical practice in the arts, humanities and social and historical sciences could advance understanding of the climate crisis and inform and promote behavioural and policy change. So I'd like to now hand over to our director, as I said, Chris Wickham, who is going to make a few points about what we've learned so far, and then Florian will take over and introduce this specific section. But I'd also like to say thank you to our speakers who have given up their time today. So thank you very much.
Okay, and welcome to all of you for this final session. I just wanted to say that this has been an extremely stimulating set of sessions. And we've been looking at the issues of how one approaches climate change across four separate sessions. Of course, we haven't had the fourth yet. We're just about to. But in the first one, we looked at, above all, climate change activism and how people in different parts of the globe were approaching the issue of climate change. I think that we were probably highly impressed by the commitment of our speakers from Kenya and from South Africa, and operating in challenging circumstances, but in places that really need to be able to confront climate change, and they clearly are doing so. Then there was a second session which I coordinated, which was focused on climate change in past societies, as guides to how different societies have coped with climate change. And the degree to which they have managed to establish sustainability in the face of climate change, resilience in the face of climate change. Because if things don't work, we're going to need to be able to operate with both of these, and we're going to need to understand what kind of things societies and political communities are going to be able to establish in order to confront climate change. Then in our third session, which Harriet organised, we were looking at how artists flag the importance of political action on climate change, and we had four particularly oratorically effective artists explaining how their work fitted into a climate change agenda and what they were trying to do in order to confront it, because we have to get inside the experience of climate change to be able to properly confront it. It's not enough to see it in terms of button pressing, or even necessarily to see it in terms of demonstrations. It's necessary to be able to internalize what we've got to need to do. And today, well, it's up to Florian to introduce translating climate change, but I think that to look at it on the level of language is again another issue about how understanding but the precise ways in which people understand climate change, the precise ways in which they articulate it, are going to be crucial as well for being able to cope with it in the future. And at this point, I stop, and over to you, Florian.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Harriet. It's been a pleasure for me to organize this series with you. I welcome everybody who's in the audience. I welcome our speakers to this fourth and final event. Harriet has very kindly explained the institutional context of this initiative and our collaboration with the Embassy and the Italian Ministry for Ecological Transition in the context of the pre-COP activities in Italy this year. I also just wanted to mention Again, that we have a collaboration between UCL and Sapienza University Rome, which draws inspiration from this series, co-curricular, collaborative seminar with a total of 36 students from Sapienza and UCL who are producing creative critical outputs in response to our series, which will be hosted on the website of the UCL Faculty of Arts and Humanities. I'd also like to welcome the 94 students who were nominated by a total of 24 universities in 12 countries in the context of the U7 Plus University Alliance. They are the participants of the 2021 Worldwide Student Forum, and we're delighted to have them in the audience today in person, or they will be joining us later by watching the recordings and sharing their comments and feedback in the appropriate ways. So we hope to reach and bring together very different audiences, different levels and different communities and different countries, which is very much the spirit of the initiative. As Chris has kindly mentioned, this final event is about translation in a very technical and specific sense, but also translation as a powerful metaphor for cultural and ecological relation, which has much exceeded its linguistic origins. Translation is something that can serve to foreground the importance of the more than human world, not merely as a backdrop or context for human stories, but as a co-constitutive presence, something that, as we've seen throughout, intersects with human culture in a single volatile temporal force field across communities, across periods, and also in individual situated artistic practice. So we've seen that the climate crisis demands a particular ability to move between and across scales to communicate the unfamiliar. It also demands conceptual inventiveness and linguistic competence. Our task as specialists in the arts and humanities is to make others aware of unfamiliar modes of communication, of thinking, counterintuitive scales. So part of this is also the attention to non-human subjectivity, a creative process that is sometimes known as interspecies translation. Translation, which on the face of it appears to be a preeminently human activity, acquires a wider meaning and comes to express extended forms of ecological relatedness. But as our guest speakers today will illustrate through examples from their own work, translation is also very strongly connected to the struggle for climate justice. It rejects the abstract, interchangeable, autonomous individual of certain forms of political theory and urges us to really stretch the limits of our imagination towards different scales to foster new forms of empathy and attention and also respect, which are an integral part of sustainability. So we think of translation together as something which is inherently attentive to interdependence of markets, interdependence of communities, interdependence of habitats. We're not interested in an idea of translation which takes an A and a B as if they were part of a topology of fixed identities, but we're interested in these ecologies of flow, which we see as a critique of globalization. Not just globalization in concrete political, economic terms, but also the idea of a single, universal, monolingual, explanatory perspective. This idea has been very much at the heart of an important initiative, which in many ways has been the source of inspiration for this, which is the Dictionary of Untranslatables, a philosophical lexicon, first published in French, edited by Barbara Cassin, and subsequently translated, but really sort of very extensively sort of rethought reimagined in different and in many ways, arguably more ambitious ways by Kassan in collaboration with our first speaker today, Professor Emily Apter and Jacques Lesra and Michael Wood, was published, as many of you no doubt will know, in 2014. Includes nearly 400 terms written, entries written by more than 150 distinguished scholars, which are terms which to an extent resist or defy an easy translation from one language and culture to another. So we build on this, we draw from this experience, and we reflect on the idea of sort of translatability or untranslatability in the context of the more than human and in the context of sustainability. I would like to very briefly introduce our panelists. I won't say anything about their many important achievements since they relate very closely to the topic of our seminar today. I would ask them to please refer to their work and to introduce aspects of their work as appropriate. It's a great pleasure for all of us to have such a distinguished panel of specialists at the end of our series. And they are, in the order in which they will speak today, Professor Emily Apter, the Silver Professor of French and Comparative Literature at New York University, NYU, Antonia Walford, who is a lecturer in digital anthropology at University College London, Anna Lora-Wainwright, who is Professor of the Human Geography of China and Fellow of St. Cross College at the University of Oxford, Federico Federici, who is Professor of Intercultural Crisis Communication at UCL, Loredana Polezzi, who is the Alphonse D'Amato Chair in Italian American and Italian Studies at Stony Brook University. And then after these 5 presentations, there will be a response by my co-organizer today, who is Professor Andrew Barry, Professor of Geography and co-chair of the UCL Anthropocene Project, also at UCL. With this, I shall now very gladly end my preliminary remarks, and let us begin with what you're all here for, which is our 5 presentations. And it's a pleasure for me to hand over first and immediately to Emily Apter, please.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you for co-organizing this panel, and also to Andrew Barry. As I'm sure we've all mentioned or will mention, we wish this were taking place in person, but hopefully there will be some momentum in the discussion and an aftermath event where we will have a chance to meet. I should just mention before I begin that what I'll present today is a kind of rough scheme of a kind of outline for a new vocabulary of climate justice, perhaps we could call it. And it sits in the larger context, in a context of work that I've been involved with for some years now and hope to finish soonish on translation and justice. It's proved to be, especially in light of the changing events from the protests after of Black Lives Matter in the wake of the Floyd murder to many, many other events. It's a very tricky topic, harder than I thought when I first framed it as something to work on. So let me begin without taking too much time over that. But please, if you have further questions, you can address them to me in the chat. Ever since Ngugi Van Tongo issued the injunction to decolonize the mind in his landmark book of 1986, the task of decolonizing Euro-dominant lexicons and critical theory, pedagogy, information technology, global economy, law, theology, biopolitics, species anthropology, and the disciplines has been paramount. In this context, translation becomes a form of concept work that mobilizes languages as a medium of critique and activism, and that refuses to confer preferential status on NGO-style English or Globish as the lingua franca of human rights, international law, and environmentalism. And while I'm wary of curatorial attitudes towards linguistic salvage that reinforce the linguist colonizer's role as savior of endangered minority languages from extinction, I remain committed to studying and maintaining vocabularies and grammars of native cosmos and world that resist translation. Given these political concerns, and as Florian mentioned, untranslatability, whose most salient symptoms are mistranslation and constant retranslation, is understood not as a block to communication or the commons, but as an enabling opacity. It connotes resistance to forced equivalence and the appropriative reach of tourism, the culture industry, and monolithic worldviews underwritten by capitalist-driven economies of surplus value production. This at least is how Edouard Glissant, the preeminent theorist of Caribbean archipelagan consciousness, saw it when he affirmed, quote, the right to opacity in his book Poetics of Relation from 1990. I began to think about untranslatability as a basis for critical methodologies in the human sciences while working on the English edition of that sprawling volume that Florian mentioned, 1.5 million words, published originally in French in 2004 under the direction of Barbara Cassin. The French title, Vocabulaire européen des philosophies dictionnaire des intraduisibles, was translated by our team as Dictionaries of Untranslatables, a Philosophical Lexicon. And you can tell that this was a bid because we took out the word European to conceive the text for future iteration, possibly a wiki, that would include non-European languages and modes of philosophizing. The book kind of sits in a large but nonetheless select group of word books. And some of the main models were, of course, the Enlightenment Encyclopédie, masterminded by Diderot and d'Alembert, André Lalande's Technical and Critical Vocabulary Philosophy of 1902-23, Laplanche and Pontalis's 1967, The Language of Psychoanalysis, Émile Benvenist's Dictionary of Indo-European Concepts and Society, published in 1969, and Reinhard Koselleck's Geschichtliche Grundbegriffe, a dictionary of political and social concept history, published in 2004, so the same year as the Cassin. And along another axis, the project was indebted to Raymond Williams' compendium of political and aesthetic keywords, many of them, of course, informed by British Marxism of the 60s and 70s. Unlike all these word books, the French vocabulaire approached concept philosophy through the history of a word's translation. And as I mentioned, it's mistranslation or it's non-translation, it's carryover from one language to another, like the term Dasein, without being translated. For Cassin, what mattered most was how an untranslatable performed. In the ensemble of her writings on the pre-Socratics and the Sophists, she used this construct to point up the instability of meaning and the role of nonsense in sense-making. She underscored the performative dimension of sophistry as an art of doing things with words, what she sometimes calls logology. And she identified a distinct temporality of translation, grounded in the premise that translational labor is interminable, incomplete, a process philosophy of infinitude, if you will. Despite its ostensible aim to democratize political philosophy's political estates by expanding the field of what counts as philosophical, there were often words like ser and estar in Spanish, that split in the verb to be, that would be not taken on as a philosophical concept in most dictionaries of philosophy, like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that it looked at parts of speech or some idiomatic constructions that normally wouldn't make it into an official vocabulary of philosophy. Nonetheless, the dictionary reinforced certain big key words. They gave a lot of space to things like subject, truth, mimesis, will, Welt. And it also gave a lot of space to dominant philosophical languages like Greek, Latin, German, French, and English, at the expense of the smaller Euro languages targeted for inclusion, such as Russian, Spanish. Well, Spanish hardly a smaller language, but Portuguese, Italian, Danish, Dutch, or Romanian. The failure to include vernacular and indigenous languages, as well as dialects and creoles, amounted to a lost opportunity to add linguistic depth to the history of imperialism within philosophy and to ascertain the damages of epistemicide. Funded, as I mentioned, or may not have mentioned, but funded by the European Union, its conceptual contents delimited by a European scope, the Dictionary of Untranslatables from today's vantage calls out for reorientation and supplementation. Some of this process has already commenced in and through the translation of the dictionary into Arabic, Brazilian Portuguese, and African languages. There's revisionary concept work, though not focused on translation per se, in Dilip Menon's forthcoming Changing Theory, Concepts from the Global South, grouped under headings like relation, commensuration, words in motion, indeterminacy, insurrection, and so on. This volume takes inspiration from the unfinished intellectual and artistic legacies of tricontinental internationals, Afro-Asian solidarity movements in the wake of decolonization, the Bandung Conference, archipelagan consciousness as defined by Glissant, and epistemologies of the South as formulated by, among others, Latin American theorists, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, Enrique Dussel, Anibal Quijano, and Walter Mignolo, among others. Of course, much work remains to be done to decolonize translation, and bearing this in mind, it becomes in some ways more productive to treat the dictionary as a record of what's left out rather than of what was put in. The most glaring deficits, I would say, are in vocabularies of political resistance to colonial domination, systemic racism, and cultural reappropriation, terms like decolonial, decoloniality, subaltern, indigeneity and indigenismo, Afro-pessimism, reparations, cultural appropriationism. And of course, also terms of climate change and planetary justice, planetarity, Anthropocene, terraforming, slow violence, extractivism, overburden, energy descaling, toxic capitalism, climate Caucasianism, a new term for colonial Eurocene, for the colonial Eurocene, ecocide, and so on. And I'll go through a few of these. The absence of eco-political terms is particularly glaring. Kant's universal natural history of the theory of the heavens doesn't feature in any of the entries devoted to Kantian concepts. Carl Schmitt's 1942 Land and Sea, a World Historical Meditation, is mentioned only glancingly. Ecosophie, ikasophie, Felix Guattari's fascinating term for transversal axes of cognition and environmental milieu, coined in the early 1990s, is nowhere highlighted. And Bruno Latour's Turanian glossary of Gaia isn't there because it wasn't yet invented. What is there? A short entry on nature written by Pascal David that examines the Latin word natura as a translation for the Greek physis. Its focus is on Heidegger's rendering of physis as Aufgang, opening up, emergence, as Aufgehen in the sense of growth and fluorescence, as Geschlecht in the sense of generation, line, race, species, and as das Grundwort des anfänglichen Denkens, the basic word of beginning thought. Interesting as this is, the connections to ecology are never drawn. In my capacity as editor of the English edition, I had discretion to commission a very few entries here and there. And I asked Gayatri Chakraborty-Spivak to contribute a short entry on planetarity. In Death of a Discipline, Spivak had used this term to invoke a relationship between the human and natural worlds that is, quote, in excess of capitalist globalization. In her piece for the dictionary, she questioned the unproblematized globalism issuing forth from Western reason and universalism of environmentalist discourse. The most significant move was to cast planetarity as a mode of alterity that embraced Aboriginal animism alongside the spectral white mythologies of post-rational science. In the context of today's collaborative exchange, I now think it might be interesting to compile a transnational, multilingual climate change lexicon or lexicon of climate justice that would not only foreground planetarity, but also terms like ecocide applied by Vishwas Satgar to the large-scale destruction of human and non-human nature, or socio-ecological systems by human agency, and quote, arising from the entanglements of natural and social relations within imperial modes of relation. Another term might be the ZAD, an acronym for Zone à Défendre, referring to the area squatted by airport protesters in Notre-Dame-des-Landes and transformed into a site of resistant gardening and cooperative living. I'd also be tempted to include Zomia, proposed by Wilhelm von Schlindel and elaborated by James C. Scott, to designate forested regions that lie in high altitudes and at the edges of nation states. Toto Abidjan and Pujita Gua placed the Zomia at the conceptual crux of their forest curriculum, which emphasized an ecosophical mode of thinking rooted in the cosmologies of the forested belt that connects South and Southeast Asia. Zomia, they say, has been used by those resisting state control, making kin with the swamps, leaves, mosquitoes, ghosts of the forest to ward off the state and its agents. Zomia is a neologism introduced into the vocabulary of ecopolitics because no other comparable term pre-exists. At other times, familiar words are effectively translated by dint of their being decentered from conventional usage. Consider the term toxicity, marshaled increasingly to denote a hostile environment in life and work. Declared the International Word of the Year in 2018 by the Oxford Dictionaries, where it competed against things like gaslighting and techlash, toxic wavers between a warning and a diagnostics of harm. Its meaning has migrated from material reference to poisonous chemicals, waste dumps, air, material and soil pollution, acid rain, food contamination, and bad stuff in your body, oxidants or drugs, to metaphoric expressions like toxic social environment, toxic assets, routinely whitewashed through philanthropic donations, or toxic waste as a term for hate speech, toxic data, toxic personality, and toxic masculinity, generic slang for misogyny, machismo, bullying, male entitlement, or masculinity tout court. Toxic derives from Greek toxikon pharmakon, signifying bow or weapon. Here, the poison at the tip of the arrow, through part-whole substitution, produces a mind meld of toxin and weapon, of phallic privilege and polluting shaft. Accordingly, the antidote, trigger warning, becomes interchangeable with toxicity alert, activated to ensure a space that will be safe because it is protected against power abuse, gender harming, and other offenses against dignity of person. Toxic, one might say, is an exemplary word in motion, traveling from epidemiology to soil and climate, to sexuality and social safety, and of course in the reciprocal directions as well. In the US today, safe climate is more likely to be taken as a qualifier of implemented protections against sexual harassment and gender discrimination than as an indicator of physical health, pollution-free air, or landscapes insulated against rising seas, eroded soil, wildfires, and drought. Conversely, dioxins, or 2,4,5-T as labeled by Dow, can acquire metaphoric powers that they wouldn't have in science alone. Charting Dow Chemicals' global history of harm, Jennifer Wenzel links Indra Sinha's Bhopal novel, Animals, People, to Agent Orange and the acute silicosis epidemic resulting from Union Carbide's excavation of the Hawk's Nest Tunnel in West Virginia. The transnational trail of carcinogenic chemicals connecting far-flung nations, ethnicities, classes, and languages models for Wenzel a new comparative literature, one that is especially attuned to the toxic sublime, that's her term, or the ecocidal dynamics of what she calls extractivist aesthetics. The leaching of usage, and I'm coming to my conclusion, the leaching of usage in the lexicon of toxicity strangely mimics the seepage and dissemination of toxic antigens, and it poses a capital translation problem, both intralingual and interlingual. American parlance insists on toxicity's threat to safety of person, itself a term imbued with Lockean notions of private self-interest, or as Jane Elliott puts it, life interest, a staple notion of the microeconomic imagination whereby interest is earned on selfhood or conferred on individual social value by means of self-protection. Safety is indissociable from reference of material infrastructure. Think terms like safety locks, safe rooms, nuclear fallout shelters, gated communities, detox centers, oxygen chambers, and HVAC interiors. In the era of COVID-19, the parameters of environmental safety as a mark of safe haven have expanded further, measured now in aureoles of social distancing around the bodies or the shaded areas of epidemiological danger that landscape circulation paths. Restricted traffic patterns and prescribed modes of interaction brought on by the coronavirus remind us that safe space depends on choreographies of immunocompromise, backing off, skirting around, scampering away, cleansing touch. Each gesture bespeaks a profound state of existential social aversity, coextensive with viral autoimmunity. The latter construed by Elizabeth Povinelli as the outcome of capitalism's extractive exhaustion of any form of existence it encounters, her words. Needless to say, these associations would be almost impossible to transpose into other languages, especially non-European ones. Climate speak, eco-theory, or planet talk, as Spivak calls it, is, I've been suggesting, a complex meta-language, a special case of translation that monitors normative shifts and turns in everyday politics and ways of addressing or not addressing the historicity of climate catastrophe and species extinction. Part of the task of translation within the comparative humanities and social sciences, I would suggest, includes training the ear to decode the languages, human and non-human, of climate injustice. It involves tracking the material, transnational networks of words in motion, and it turns to concept work for critical vocabularies of extractivism, drawing on indigenous cosmologies and ways of rethinking the nomos of the earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an exceptionally rich presentation, and I'm sure that your invitation for us all to train our ear and to sort of really be very attentive to the way in which these sort of normative impositions are both shaping our relation with non-human nature, and how our relation with non-human nature itself becomes a kind of sort of then a paradigm or a meta-language which informs other parts of everyday life. I think that invitation is very, very much welcome, and something which we will want to follow up in discussion. So thanks again. I'd just like to say to the members of our audience that you are very welcome to pose questions to Professor Emily Apter, or sort of first responses to this paper in the Q&A for now. We will keep a record of this and we will then use this as the basis for our general discussion. In the final part of the first presentation, we heard about the importance of paying attention to indigenous knowledge practices and traditions, and this connects very nicely to what our next speaker will talk about. So allow me to hand over to Antonia Walford now, please.
Great, thank you, Florian, and also echoing Emily's thanks to you and Andrew for organising this very interesting panel. I'm going to crack on because I've timed myself and I know I'm right on the edge of my time limit. In this short presentation, I'm going to be exploring the notion of translation and indeed, I think, a version of untranslatability. I think we can discuss the resonances with Emily's work afterwards in interesting ways. I'm going to be exploring this in the specific context of the relationship between indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. I think this relation often seems to be troubling for those working on climate change from both policy and scholarly perspectives, because although there's been a general consensus, I think, that bodies like the UN or UNESCO or events like the COP need to include indigenous knowledge in their understanding of the environment and environmental crisis and mitigation and indeed justice, how exactly to do that is not at all agreed upon. On the one hand, it's considered that there has to be a sense of communication and common language, hence the invention of acronyms and neologisms like TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. On the other hand, the acts of translation that render that communication possible, anthropologists amongst others have argued, are often a violent overwriting of indigenous understandings of the natural world, as when, for example, indigenous logics for not overhunting in an area of forest due to the potential wrath of various spirits is rendered as, or translated as, an evolutionary mechanism for survival, rather than having anything to do with spirits at all. One approach to this sort of translation conundrum has been presented by an anthropologist, Brazilian anthropologist called Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, through his notion of controlled equivocation. In this presentation, I'm going to give a quick sketch of this controlled equivocation as one possible form of translation for us to think about, before pointing towards one question at least that it raises for me and for this conference panel. Drawing on his long-term research with Amerindian peoples, Viveiros de Castro describes how, in Amerindian understandings, members of the same species all see themselves as human and see their behavior and their bodies in terms of human culture. That is, all, or at least many species see themselves in the same way as humans or subjects. Thus, when a person sees blood, a jaguar sees manioc beer. When a person sees, and I quote here, a muddy salt lick on a riverbank, tapirs, which are kind of jungle pig, see their big ceremonial house. The important point, however, that Viveiros de Castro draws from his ethnographic material is that it is not that there is one referent, so blood or a salt lick, and 2 points of view on that one referent. Rather, for the people that he worked with, the referent is multiple. It is both objectively blood and beer at the same time. That is, the jaguar and the person are in fact referring in the same capacity as they both see themselves as humans, i.e. capable of having a subject position, to two very different referents. Viveiros de Castro succinctly refers to this as multinaturalism as opposed to multiculturalism, where we in the West, he says, have many cultures or interpretations and one form of nature or one referent. Amerindian peoples have many natures, many referents, and one form of culture, one form of interpreting, one way of being human. This indigenous cosmology has come to be known as Amerindian perspectivism and has been substantially developed by other anthropologists such as Tania Stolz-Lima and Aparecida Vilaça and Jose Antonio Kelly, to name a few. So if we can think of perspectivism as a form of translation, which Viveiros de Castro explicitly does, and I quote here, the aim of perspectivist translation is not that of finding a synonym, a co-referential representation in our human conceptual language for the representations of other species of subject used to speak about one and the same thing. Rather, the aim is to avoid losing sight of the difference concealed within equivocal homonyms between our language and that of other species, since we and they are never talking about the same things, end of quote. So what we're looking at is a practice not of finding synonyms, he's saying, that is different, if not similar words for the same thing, but homonyms, that's the same word for different things. Hence the idea of equivocation is key here. One word which seems to slip between multiple meanings, or in this case, reference. And the point exactly is not to be caught out by such equivocational slipperiness. This is a framework that also holds for indigenous relationships with the state or with other outsiders who they come into contact with, including scientists. For example, Jose Antonio Kelly studied the relationship between the Venezuelan state and the Yanomami, who are a group of indigenous people in Venezuela and a bit in Brazil, in the implementation of state healthcare in Yanomami territory. Analyzing a series of meetings between the medical professionals of the Ministry of Health and the Yanomami, Kelly notes the way in which each seems to be trying to translate each other differently. Whereas the Venezuelan state, in the name of what they call cultural authenticity and the preservation of an indigenous identity, is interested in what they call making Indians, the Yanomami are instead looking to this biomedical health system to use white culture at the service of reproducing Yanomami society, which they call becoming white. So for example, whereas the doctors see the Yanomami desire for what is called white man's goods, what the Yanomami call white man's goods, as demonstrating rampant materialism and a loss of cultural authenticity, the Yanomami are interested in the cosmological efficacy of the relation that the act of obtaining those goods manifests in differentiating between those who give and those who receive. So they're appropriating those goods to be more Yanomami. At the heart of this is an equivocation around what white and Indian in fact refer to. And I quote here from Kelly: Yanomamis are neither becoming the white people that white people conceive as such, nor do they see themselves as being like the Indians that the state would like to restore. Kelly points out that these uncontrolled or unrecognized equivocations are often taken as either understandings, so when the state officials and the Yanomami seem to agree, or misunderstandings when there is conflict between them. But approaching these relations as a question of understanding or misunderstanding presumes that the officials and the Yanomami have a shared system of referential meaning. In fact, Kelly argues, these intercultural relations need to be approached by the anthropologists as evidence of the multiple referential universes that are in play, as both sides struggle to translate the other side into something recognizable. This then points us towards the second aspect of Viveris de Castro's theory. Rather than simply a description of Amerindian ways of relating, what Viveris de Castro argues is that this Amerindian method of translation needs to be allowed to recursively shape the anthropological method of translation, cultural translation, which is kind of what anthropologists do. If, and I quote again, if indigenous perspectivism is a theory of the equivocation, that is, of the referential alterity between homonymic concepts, as we saw earlier, Viveris de Castro then potentializes this ethnographic realization, arguing that instead of translating indigenous realities into our own conceptual language, anthropologists must recognize and maintain or control the equivocation that exists between their anthropological referential universe and that of the people they're trying to describe. So this then is a form of translation that is meant to be anti-assimilationist. Translation becomes an act of resistance, revealing the difference that is constitutive of any relation, and it is up to the anthropologist to ensure this, that is, to control this, hence the term controlled equivocation. Although I'm far from an expert in indigenous cosmologies and peoples, my own research is actually to do with, is in the anthropology of science, and I work mostly with environmental scientists. I did have the opportunity to do a small bit of research in the north of the Brazilian Amazon in a place called São Gabriel de Cachoeira, with a project called Indigenous Environmental Agents, or so it's Agentes Indígenas de Manejo Ambiental in Portuguese, which is shortened to AIMA. The AIMAs, these indigenous agents, receive a small grant from an NGO called the Instituto Socioambiental in return for conducting various sorts of research into different themes of cultural importance around the idea of environmental management. So it might involve fish or fruit or agriculture. In the case of those AIMA investigating the fish stocks, for example, they collect quantitative data, such as the length and weight of fish caught. They draw beautiful illustrations of the fish, and they keep daily and very detailed diaries about different people who went fishing and at what times they went and the level of the river and things like that. They also attend a meeting 3 times a year during which they compare the results with each other of their own research and show it to the conhecedores, to the elders from different communities known to have ritual and mythic knowledge. During the 5 weeks I spent with the AIMAs, so nothing compared to the really long periods that Viveris de Castro Kelly spends, so as I said, this is very preliminary research for me, I was interested exactly in the relationship between scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge that the AIMAs were working with themselves. As such, I found Viveris de Castro's approach to be inspiring and generative, as a way to think about the complexities of this. However, at the same time, there's nevertheless a form of essentialism here which I felt uneasy with. This is not so much, as others have suggested in a critical vein, because difference itself gets reified in opposition to identity or commonality, because I think that those critiques, as I'll come on to later, miss the point that the difference is, I think, as Emily's already touched on, constitutive of the relationality itself. So it doesn't have to be opposed to relationality or how we might communicate. Difference is constitutive of it. My misgivings, however, were around like essentialism or othering of this approach, was around who gets to do the translating, equivocating, or othering, and why they might be doing it. So one of the observations that I made in São Gabriel was that most of the interactions and discussions I had seemed to center on exactly who was controlling these equivocations. In fact, the people I talked to had their own ideas about white worlds and indigenous worlds and how they might be related to each other in different ways. And they seemed to be constantly and explicitly reflecting on those relationships and the differences between them. I found that people in São Gabriel were controlling and uncontrolling equivocations simultaneously and reflexively. And as a result, equivocations, these kinds of slippages, seem to slip around and shift around quite rapidly. This implies that it might make sense to understand this particular intercultural interaction, these acts of translation, as complex, unstable, and shifting equivocational choreographies in which people, including anthropologists, including me, are involved in open-ended relational negotiations rather than as set coordinates of referential alterity. Now I'm going to give an example to illustrate my point. Ronaldo is a young Tucanoan Aima who I had the chance to talk to on several occasions. When I asked him about his relationship to the elders, to the conhecedores, Ronaldo told me it's very important, the knowledge of the elders, because their knowledge sometimes approximates or comes close to scientific knowledge. I asked him for an example. Well, he said, we asked them, the conhecedores, about the constellations, and we drew a graph using the knowledge of the conhecedores. And then Paulo, who is a scientist who was associated with the project, got the data from the National Water Agency. And our graph is very similar to the Whites' research. The climate is changing, the same as the old people are suggesting. The conhecedores are curious about these changes, and the brancos as well, and the whites as well. They have the same knowledge, right? But is it the same knowledge, I asked? Well, it's also very different from the knowledge of the whites, he replied immediately, because our ancestors thought that man, homem, the term he used, they have these parts which represent the lower, the middle, the submiddle, and the world where we live, that would be the heart, he said, indicating the different parts of his own body. He continued, that's why they bless. This part signifies the support, the thorax, where man lives supported in a cuya, which is a type of bowl. And so they bless each year, each constellation, each season they bless. But after the missionaries arrived, they stopped burning the resin in the communities and stopped doing the ritual that controls the weather. And the world started to change. The old people mention this. They never say it directly, but I'm certain. When the thunder comes, my father makes a ritual cigarette and blesses, and he teaches me, always teaches me, in order not to get sick from the lightning, he makes a protective cigarette. He smokes it out. The thunder's manioc beer is poison for us. It transmits disease. The white man, he understands everything very differently from us. He is the brother of the Waimasa, the enchanted ones. That's why they, the whites, aren't affected by the diseases that make us sick. For us, it is different. So my conversation with Ronaldo was peppered with explanations of the relationship between os brancos and os índios in this way. But it was also evidence of a constant negotiation of continuity and difference. Ronaldo is carefully negotiating the differences between the pesquisa do branco, the white person's research, and the knowledge of the elders, while at the same time maintaining a kind of politico-ontological parity. He was very comfortable talking to me about the ways in which brancos and Indios live in different worlds, which sometimes overlap and sometimes do not. In this sense, he seemed quite at ease controlling the equivocation between the two worlds himself, as it were. However, Ronaldo also frames this difference in terms of his own cosmology. The brancos are related to the Waimasa, the enchanted ones or invisible entities, and this is what makes them different. So at the same time as being aware of the differences, he's also positing what we might think of as an indigenous theory for that difference. This capacity for equivocations to be revealed and negated is also apparent when we consider the other side of this particular relation. In their diaries, the Aima have suggested that there is a lack of fish because the fish are turning into birds. This was a result of one of the Aima meetings with the conhecedores, during which the conhecedores decided that the lack of fish was because ritual blessings, or benzimentos, were not being said frequently enough, and so the fish were turning into birds and then attacking the palm trees. They decided to send some of the Aima upriver with a specially blessed piece of tree resin to burn at the head of the river to try to slow or even reverse this transformation. When I asked Paolo, the scientist who collaborates with the IMA on the project and had worked in the region for decades, what he thought about this, he said quite openly, yes, for me, this thing of fish transforming into birds is completely out of the question. But it's also, what my opinion is irrelevant, because they will not look to me to resolve that problem. They'll look to me to resolve the problem of the overfishing with nets. They'll not come to me to resolve that other part. So my opinion, if I agree or disagree, is totally irrelevant, because I'm not a specialist in that kind of stuff. He went on to tell me that holding two contradictory positions in one's head is not something special about indigenous Amerindians, it's simply, quote, human nature. So both Ronaldo and Paolo are clear that there is a difference between what they respectively think and act upon. On one side, Ronaldo is managing the gap between indigenous and white people's knowledge and giving an indigenous theory for that difference. On the other side, Paolo is very conscious of the differences between his understanding and that of the conhecedores, and is sensitive to the fact that this is because there are two very different worlds of knowledge at play. At the same time, he also gives, at base, a reason for such contradictions to be held, which is he calls human nature. What I think my conversations with Paolo and Ronaldo show is that there is a common understanding that things are different for Indios and Brancas. At the same time, there's a recursive reiteration of the equivocation, shifting it around. What that equivocation consists in is different for each. For Ronaldo, it consists in a difference between Indios and Brancos. For Paolo, it consists in a commonality between them. Nevertheless, the two of them both control and do not control the referential multiplicity inherent in their relationship at the same time. This would imply that understanding these sorts of intercultural contexts, as I've said, these kind of acts of practical translation when these knowledges come up against each other in the world, necessitates taking account of a much more dynamic and distributed choreography of equivocation and difference in assimilation than is often permitted. Several anthropologists have been critical of Viveros de Castro's work, which relies on a very particular idea of alterity drawn from French post-structural thought, on the grounds that it denies the possibility of communicating in common causes, and by extension, because it means that we are all operating in incommensurable worlds, and that it therefore others indigenous people in reductive and appropriative ways. Anthropologists sympathetic to Viveros de Castro's position have argued back that, to the contrary, assuming commonality is a form of violence, and that we need difference to be the starting point when we think about the relationship between indigenous and scientific understandings of the world. But what I saw in São Gabriel was that people were being a lot more creative, fluid, and multiple in terms of equivocations than this opposition allows for. Different and explicit theories of commonality and difference themselves rub shoulders, including anthropological ones that indigenous people had read in anthropology journals, or stories that medical officers had learned from indigenous friends. Rather than worry a priori about commonality versus differentiation, my hunch is that different contexts all provide their own theories of translation, and our job is to learn what those are. Anthropologists are often called on to be cultural and linguistic translators, but we are not the sole or privileged translators. We aren't the only ones who control the equivocations. So we are perhaps better thought of as documenters of the myriad ways in which people are doing their own forms of translation all the time. This may seem like a kind of small and inconsequential point, but it has another implication that I just want to end on, coming back round to the question of who is doing translations and why. I really appreciated the call for this panel, but as I said, I in no way would consider myself an expert on indigenous understandings of climate change. In fact, the experts on indigenous understandings of climate change are, of course, indigenous people who work on climate change. They should be here on this panel discussing these issues with us. The fact that they're not, and we did try to invite some, is in itself, in part because of issues of linguistic and other forms of colonialism that, again, Emily has already talked about. We're all speaking English here, for example. But it is also about much more apparently mundane questions of technical infrastructures and finances. We should have a budget for translation costs for all conferences. We should have simultaneous translation as the norm. We should have flexible timing and formats. So I can't help to think, as I write this, that alongside the kinds of dense theoretical work that I've spent the last 20 minutes doing, maybe we also need to tackle those very mundane technical issues that would allow, as much as possible, for people to talk for themselves.
Thank you very much, Antonia. That was an excellent paper and a very powerful ending. Also, I think for all of us, an invitation to continue this conversation in multiple forms beyond the end of our session today, because it's clearly, we all, I think, feel this is the beginning of a project, even if this discussion happens at the end of our series of 4 roundtables. I also very much like the idea of equivocation as something which is can enable a conversation and a project which I think emerged very strongly from your project, from your presentation as well. So thank you very much. I remind our members of the audience that they are welcome to share any questions in the Q&A, any comments, including very specific concrete questions. If there's anything that any information that you missed that you'd like to sort of follow up on, or first suggestions that you'd like to share. We continue now in a very empirical form, testing some of the assumptions about translatability and untranslatability, and that have been presented in different contexts as a situated knowledge moving from Latin America to China with the work of Anna Lora-Wainwright. So over to you, Anna, please.
Thank you so much, Florian. And I also want to thank the previous two speakers, well, you and Andrew for co-organizing this, but the previous two speakers for the excellent ground they've laid for all of us. I feel rather humbled coming now. So let me just share my screen so that I can share a presentation on PowerPoint. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to briefly overview some of the terms in Chinese public discourse that explicitly relate to or may be relevant to debates on climate change. And I hasten to add, this isn't, most of this isn't based on my work, but it's based on a review I've done of colleagues' work. I've worked on the environment in China, not on climate change directly, both individually and as part of various collaborations. And I think for the purposes of today, it's useful to have a kind of broad overview of some of the key terms for debate and some of the key events, if you like, that we could see as starting points for a broader discussion, for a more inclusive discussion about climate change in China. Okay. So I want to start from the really useful, valuable point made by Rob Weller in his book, Discovering Nature, that the idea of nature in China, as anywhere, of course, is multiple. It draws on diverse intellectual and religious traditions, on a variety of experiences with the physical world. And here we could think of, for instance, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism as some of those intellectual traditions, but also, of course, varieties of socialism and a global discourse of sustainability and development as well. So just to brainstorm some of these terms, the term for nature itself in Chinese is ziran, which implies spontaneity. So you have a kind of particular vision of nature there already. And Taoist views really relate quite well to that idea of nature expressed by ziran. We think about foregrounding nature's ability to flourish, about qi, or energy as it's typically translated, flowing through both nature, but also humans, and sort of connecting both. And I'd recommend you look at James Miller's work on these issues in particular. A rather different concept, but also an important, influential one, is the idea of unity of man and nature, as in a Confucian vision, cosmological vision of harmony. But of course, there are also very anthropocentric views in Chinese intellectual history too. If we think of one of Mao's most famous slogans in relation to the environment and nature, being man must conquer nature, and of the militaristic language that was employed, I'd recommend here you look at Shapiro's work in particular on that period. But that anthropocentric focus carries on in various ways in the after Mao's death, in the economic reforms, through terms such as pollute now, clean up later, which is very much an ethos of the early reform period, and which shifts rather in more recent years. So in later reform, during the later economic reforms, we have a much more eco-friendly kind of vocabulary, sustainable development, scientific views of development, for instance, and also some calls for stronger justice, a consideration of justice through pan-US eco-socialism. Now, most relevant to today's are the terms of it which have emerged under the current leadership. Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang have waged, as you may know, a war on pollution, for instance, and here you see the militaristic language emerging, but in a very different way. But there's also a different relation to nature coming out of expressions like Xi's famous statement, clear waters and green mountains are as valuable as mountains of gold and silver. And here you can see a much, if you like, a much more harmonious view, but also one that begins to outline a particular role for China as an environmental vanguard. Now, ecological civilization, of course, is probably the most discussed and most commonly used term by the current leadership in relation to the environment. It was first proposed by Hu Jintao in 2007. It's since been enshrined in the constitution. And this really, to me, continues in the trend of anthropocentrism that I've just outlined, but also focuses and also follows a path of promoting science and technology that is not new, but also focuses on China's intellectual tradition of harmony with nature to showcase a particular position for China culturally, not only politically and technologically. So on the one hand, through this term, we have a strong political push, for instance, through the formation of a new Ministry of Ecology and Environment that replaced its predecessor in 2018, a very strong recentralization of environmental governance in China, through, for instance, increasing number of top-down mass campaigns on pollution, but also a strong emphasis on science, technology, and innovation, which, as you look at the 5-year plans in 2016 and the most recent one comes to the fore. There's a strong technocratic focus, a focus on clean production, on circular economy, on market solutions. And I've looked at some of this in work I've done with colleagues on waste recycling and circular economy. What I find most interesting in some ways is the ways in which the term is mobilized as a way of rejuvenating China's position vis-a-vis itself, but also vis-a-vis global challenge of climate change. Now, China here, through its particular position, is showcasing not only a reaction to a crisis, but also a way of embracing its own heritage. And this, to me, is also a response to a strong international pressure and a way of not looking as though it is simply responding to international pressures, but also to its own special traditions and heritage. Now, there's a balancing act here as well in the term ecological civilization between the state posing as a civilizing agent for a sustainable and clean future for China, but also the state hailing particular kinds of subjects. I'd encourage anybody who's interested to look at Elizabeth Lord's work here in particular, and to reflect on the ways in which particular subjects, typically urban subjects, middle-class subjects, are viewed as the classic agents of environmental protection and stewardship, whereas rural areas are, if you like, catching up in the sort of evolutionary scheme of things. I'd encourage us all to take a critical stance on whether the term ecological civilization and the approach it takes is necessarily distinctly Chinese, or whether indeed China or Asia are uniquely positioned to tackle these challenges, and to reflect really on where this terminology comes from and whose power, if you like, it's showcasing and with what outcomes. I'd recommend also looking at Michael Hathaway's work, Environmental Winds, which wasn't on ecological civilization. It was published in 2013, but I think is a really good starting point to think about the ways in which ecological, environmental terms travel between places and political contexts. thinking about the ways in which ecological civilizations embraced in the public sphere, I'd really recommend looking at Mette Hansen and Leo's work, and also her broader team based in Oslo for the project Airborne. And I want to showcase some of their work here. So they explain ecological civilizations not only a framework for a concrete technical, legal, and social standard, but it's also what they call an abstract imaginary that's helping to legitimize and revitalize China's green public sphere. So in other words, it's a tool for those in the public sphere who want to advocate for the environment to potentially gain legitimacy if they know where the boundaries are and not to overstep those boundaries. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. What their work shows is that there's a plethora of terms emerging in recent years, from PM 2.5, carbon dioxide, to broader terms like ecological, environmental protection, green environment, that are serving a varied range of audiences and advocacy groups. So I'd recommend, again, you look at some of their work on this. Now, I'm an anthropologist, and anthropologists have a, let's say, a skeptical position on surveys typically, but I still think it's really important to look at these. And there are a number of surveys have been done recently on awareness of climate change in China. I just flag one that was published. There is the discussion was published recently in the China Quarterly. And here, predictably, the survey shows that groups, including particularly women and younger Chinese, tend to be more receptive, more concerned with climate change. And also those living in areas where there is less dependency on carbon-intensive industries tend to be more concerned with climate change. Now, I find these points valuable, but I also want to reflect critically on how concerns with climate change might in fact be channeled in places where the language employed by these surveys might not be resonating in particular with those communities. If I think of some of the work I've done with colleagues about 10 years ago in an industrialized part of China, dependency there clearly was causing feelings of powerlessness and inevitability, but not a lack of concern. And to me, we need to be aware of writing off a lack of concern when it's not apparent, but to think about how it might be voiced through different terminologies, perhaps. Also, I would say there's a balance here between the state posing as the ultimate vanguard for the environment, but also calling upon individuals to voice their responsibilities, to channel their responsibilities. And some of the work, the critical work that's been done on surveys, reflects on how this discourse of the state as a key agent may be resulting, in fact, in individuals attributing less responsibility to themselves and more responsibility to the state for solving these challenges. Above all, sort of joining with Antonia's point and with Emily's points earlier, I feel we really need to break out of Euro-American centrism and to tune into these new vocabularies, linguistic or otherwise, that show concern for the environment. I'd recommend here anyone interested take a look at a volume called Chinese Environmental Humanities, published a couple of years ago. But it also, we move beyond thinking about only climate change and to think of culturally and morally resonant languages that might be drawn upon for these discussions, particularly in areas in political circumstances where some of these terms may be more or less politically viable. So if I reflect on sort of the development of a so-called green public sphere over the past 20 years, this was first used as a term by Yang and Calhoun in their work on a campaign to stop dams on the Yangtze River in southwest China. And here they talked about so-called green speak agents who were able to raise concerns in the public sphere and to frame them in a fruitful way. Again, I refer you to Andrew Murtha's work on some of this as well. And the concept of embedded activism here is really important in understanding their positionality. Given the political context of China, any effort to engage critically with environmental issues has to be done very carefully in more or less collaboration with the state. If we think of how NGOs have changed over the past 20 years or so, there's been a huge growth in environmental NGOs, a huge diversity. I've had students who've worked, for instance, on student groups in Beijing. There are government organized NGOs which do a rather different kind of policy advocacy work, an increasing number of grassroots NGOs as compared to at the very beginning. In the 90s. What I find perhaps most interesting is the growth in citizen science initiatives. So we have NGOs like the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, which reports pollution in real time on their website, in effect to name and shame polluters and pressure them to clean up their act. But also it's designed and championed a number of apps, as have done a number of other NGOs, and also used monitoring, air quality monitoring or water quality monitoring in collaboration with local communities. Now the scene is a very shifting scene, and anyone who works in environmental NGOs in China knows that the atmosphere, the political atmosphere can change very quickly. And partly in reaction to that, it's really important to collaborate with colleagues, and you see NGOs doing that very often. But we've also seen the rise of a much more diverse set of actors, including celebrities, netizens, journalists, and artists, as I refer to in a moment. One NGO that I think is particularly worth thinking about here today is CYCAN, the China Youth Climate Action Network. Now, youth and university students in particular are in a prominent position as advocates for climate change. Climate strikes obviously have been substantially out of bounds for Chinese youth, with some exceptions. And by and large, these youth advocates follow the model of embedded activism I just outlined. So they typically engage in educational awareness raising activities, they plant trees, they learn and teach how to recycle waste. But they also look to climate change mitigation and green technology as opportunities for employment in an extremely competitive job market. So I've copied here some of the way in which they describe their work on their website. The initiative they have called Green Colors for the Climate, I think, is significant because it really speaks to this interest in and focus on gaining experience, providing networks, providing internships, and ultimately employment, but also very strongly about working with rather than against the government. Now, there have been several documentaries that I fantasized about talking about and didn't have space, but there was one that I certainly couldn't miss out on, and this is Under the Dome. It's potentially the most talked about and most watched documentary on environment in China. It illustrates also how ephemeral and shifting the edge of acceptability might be, and how much this has to do not only with the message of the documentary, but more crucially with the public's response. Now, Chai Jing is an influential TV news anchor and former investigative journalist. She produced and self-funded this documentary that was hailed in the foreign media as China's Silent Spring moment. It was released in 2015 at a very strategic time just before an important meeting. It was welcomed by the new environment minister. It was publicized on state-run media. And there's some important things to note about the ways in which it framed itself. So at the outset, the whole thing is framed as a personal and an emotional mission through the experience of fear for her newly born daughter's health. But parallel to Chai's own journey to awareness, fear, and advocacy as she became a mother is a linguistic journey from haze to smog. Chai asks, air pollution and PM 2.5 have been for us for so long, it's been with us for so long. Why have we only started to discuss it now? Because before it was called haze. Now, haze is natural rather than political. Smog and pollution, by contrast, imply attribution of blame, but also they imply that something can and should be done to stop it. And the shift in language underpins a shift in visibility and advocacy, the making and unmaking of pollution as a matter of concern. And we should note that the message is neither radical nor new. It doesn't advocate systemic change. It closes with a call to citizens, on citizens to take action in their own lives by driving less, by reporting environmental violations on the government hotline. Her approach and the language resemble what later became codified in the narrative of ecological civilization. So you see some of the terms that she used to describe, to reflect on the documentary when she was interviewed about it. But the extraordinary public response that it received was unexpected. Within 24 hours, it was viewed over 100 million times, and discussion of it quickly dominated social media platforms. So the popularity was likely seen as a potential threat, potentially congealing into discontent if commentary had been allowed to flow for much longer. So it was taken offline and all coverage on state media deleted. And I think this whole episode is really telling of the political volatility of opportunities for public sphere debates and quite how difficult it is to know where and what one can speak. I'm almost done, I promise. I want to finally flag some work done by a collaborator, Tom Johnson, with Katinka First on smog art, which I've pasted some of the examples that they examine on the right here. And also some of the terms that have been sort of prominent in debates on air pollution in China. I don't really want to spend time talking through them now, but we can talk about them in discussion if anyone's interested. What I want to note is that the growth of citizen science can be a double-edged sword that has mixed results. It could further exclude those who lack access to the data, as I've seen with rural communities that I've worked on in particular. And also want to flag the concept of ambiguity that Johnson and First adopt as they look at the messages that come out of so-called smog art. So to conclude, I'd argue that drawing attention to climate change is a relatively safe move politically within China's authoritarian system, and therefore potentially opens opportunities for debate and action. However, advocates have to navigate a fragile balance between posing as allies of the state and potentially critiquing policies that fall short of tackling climate change. Conversely, if the question is how to stimulate further attention to climate change among the Chinese public, it's clear that a focus on air pollution, its potential health consequences could play a crucial role in engaging culturally resonant frames in Andrew Murtha's sense. So only with an awareness of these challenges may we adequately understand the extent to which climate change is a matter of concern in contemporary China, what broader discursive frameworks may support or hinder concerns with climate change, how discourses and interests may differ across different parts of society, what are envisioned as solutions and why, and last but not least, whose experiences may be marginalized in that process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was, again, a really interesting presentation and very much, I think, connected to the previous two. So we're beginning to see some very important strands that are also emerging in our discussion, actually, in the Q&A. So I was wondering if I could, taking advantage of my role as chair, if I could sort of pause for a moment after these first three presentations and invite Emily, Apter, Antonia, Walford, and Anna Lora-Wainwright to make themselves visible for a moment, if that's okay. And if we could just sort of maybe look at some of these questions together before we move on to our final set of two speakers. I see that there is at least one by Tom Kipperwaite, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, which relates very directly to your presentation, Anna. So maybe we can start with this. How confident, I'm reading the questions out because we can see them as panelists, but the audience can't see them. The question is, how confident are you that the momentum generated by China's youth will propagate to government in the coming decade?
Thank you, Tom, for the really excellent question. I would probably approach it in a slightly different way, in the sense that I don't see it so much as a youth concern propagating into the state in a kind of unidirectional way, but there's a much more dynamic relationship going on, and a lot of different channels for communication as well. So NGOs being one of those channels, youth in particular engaging in a huge number of very different types of NGOs, some which are helping rural communities, for instance, monitoring water pollution. And I'm involved with one NGO, writing a paper with one NGO that does that, called My H2O, for instance. So I think, at least for now, the relationship is one of allyship, and for the youth, young people themselves, to be able to have a meaningful input. At all the interviews I've read with, and the conversations I've had with these advocates, tend to hover around the fact that they have to work with the state, and they have to, if you like, mobilize state vocabulary in order to effectively protect themselves and make their actions more effective. So I can talk more later, but I thought I'd start there.
Yeah, thank you. I'd also maybe like to just read out the first question, which was posted after Emily's opening presentation, where an anonymous attendee asked about the importance of translation beyond languages, the idea of localized development. And this has often been emphasized, but international funding agencies, according to the person posting the question, still often ignore these aspects of sort of situated knowledge and practice. What structural and policy change should these funding agencies require? And I guess the question is also, how can we encourage these funding agencies to sort of think differently in order to foster a better environment? Any thoughts on that?
It's a huge question, and it's not really in my bailiwick to answer, but I would say on a very practical level that agencies, although they might have footnotes about terminology in other languages, that has, from my experience of them, or even granting foundations that review applications for funding, or research and technology, search engines, things like that, they produce a kind of non-thinking monolingualism. And we've talked about English, but algorithmic languages represent a further data-driven reductionism in modes of expressionism. So we've been talking about human languages, but if you try to fan out to how species articulate, I mean, there are efforts in this direction by, I would signal Emanuel Akocha's work. He was trained as a philosopher, but also was sent to sort of botany school in high school, and wrote a wonderful book called The Life of Plants. And I think there's a whole kind of new, this doesn't help the agency question. The agency question would be, how do you actually integrate a plurilingual perspective into, and one in a highly expanded field that would include indigenous languages or dialects, into its research apparatus and its granting function, grant evaluation function? That's not an undoable project. It isn't, but it isn't done very much as far as I can see. And that's partly because there's a value of expediency, of getting resources, of problem solving. But problem solving, this is this kind of epistemological question of the problem of how you articulate concepts in languages is something that needs to be put into policy decision making, I think. But to come back to the other question of how do you, in a sense, allow species to think, or to be expressive of life forms that don't fall into anthropocentric models. We're just beginning, I think. I mean, there's, you know, all this work on Bios and Zoe, and but that has led into different kinds of almost panpsychic. How do you make a plant speak? How do you listen to a forest? And how do trees express relation? It's a new field, and philosophy, I think, has a place in it, but where that intersects with, you know, development, analytics, God knows. I see those as very divided fields for the moment.
That's really, really interesting. Thank you. Andrew's got his hand up. Andrew, please.
Yes, thanks. Just a brief comment which kind of follows from this, which relates to Emily's comment about the sort of the moment of the dictionary of untranslatables. I mean, and there is a certain resonance here with the structures of the EU in relation to translation. Part of what the EU does is render languages within the European system translatable through a whole apparatus of translation, which you see enacted in the European Parliament in documents and so forth. There are so-called official languages which are necessary. And this is, you know, hugely resourced. But I think it's a point which Antonia raised, you know, by comparison, the resources made available for translation of equivalents of non-European languages are minuscule, and therefore everything is in fact, in practice, within the world of NGOs and international organizations rendered into a kind of global English. So there's a really interesting kind of resonance between the kind of the philosophical political project of the Dictionary of Untranslatables and where we are now in terms of the wider political situation.
And I should say, in defense of the dictionary, it never ever saw itself as an exhaustive project in any way. It was seen as a first stab towards a way of working through and taking untranslatability into account, which now, since that came out in 2004, has become much more of an accepted methodology. But even when I wrote my book, you know, Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability, I got enormous pushback for even introducing the concept of untranslatability, but I really took great pains to define it in a specific way against a certain kind of global culture industry. And I was part of, I think, a larger groundswell that now takes untranslatability or non-translation studies very seriously. And, you know, I get constant correspondence and feedback that of people building and going on in different directions around this concept. And it's not meant, as I mentioned, as a refusal to translate or a resistance to intercultural communication. Far from it. But it's a way of looking at some of the colonial practices that go along with translation as they are reproduced now in technological forms of communication.
And yeah, I think one of the aspects of this change which you're describing is also just sort of an awareness which has emerged from the three presentations, sort of how quickly our sense of centers and margins is shifting. And you know, thinking of the Chinese examples that Anna's presented, you know, where there's, I think one of the books that you mentioned is the subtitle, sort of Chinese Environmental Humanities, and the subtitle is sort of Perspectives from the Margins or something, if I remember correctly. But of course, it's actually extremely problematic to think of in this vocabulary of centers and margins in the first place, which we were still relatively, you know, habitually comfortable with, I think, and sort of at the time when you started your project, Emily, which now appears very evidently much more problematic than perhaps many of the sort of early commentators in global literature and global culture thought. Yeah, thank you. I see there's another question, an anonymous question as well, which I would just like to sort of paraphrase, if I may, which is asking generally about the knowledge of biologists and ecologists versus the knowledge of politicians and historians. And I would just sort of like to pose this to you as a sort of very general interest or sort of maybe concern about the ways in which different disciplines can contribute and can be part of public debate. I don't know. I know this is a very broad question, but I wondered if any of you had any thoughts, since one of our aims was obviously very much to have a range of disciplinary perspectives here today. How is the role of the humanities also importantly to mediate and to sort of translate, as it were, the knowledge of the STEM subjects, and to sort of make sure that the perspectives of, say, biologists, for example, is actually studied and shared more extensively. So is that something which any of you would like to remark upon? While I let you sort of ponder this, there's also another question from Curly Monang for Emily Apter, referring back to Glissant's right to opacity and the right to self-determination by the oppressed. How then can climate change interventions take place in vulnerable communities when the interventions are still top-down, power-centered, and reflecting an intellectual superiority?
That's the big question. If we had an answer to that one, we'd be a lot further along. I mean, I feel like that's an articulation of the project, you know, almost by using the word methodology, you're in the trap. And it's fascinating. I mean, how do you, in a sense, come up with the terminologies that are self-critical and auto-revisionist without becoming too preciously self-involved in a kind of solipsism of your own worries about yourself as a speaker, that take the focus away from climate change and onto Western people tearing their hair out about how to speak. And that's, you know, maybe to come back to the other question, this is where politicians get very impatient, and there needs almost to be another kind of work that would be mediating, that would somehow find ways to build in a certain autocritical frameworks and into modes of proceeding that are not top down, that, you know, and I think Antonia and Laura have intimated some of the ways this has begun to happen in anthropology. Anthropology becomes a very important discipline if it can do that. One last thing I would just say is that academics, in my ken anyway, have a remarkable tendency to live in a bubble and ignore issues of realpolitik. We don't want to get our feet wet, and something I feel like is part of the critical project of intervention is taking on seriously and effectively the language of politicians in the area of climate denial. In the US, it's massive. It's linked to misinformation campaigns. And, you know, I feel like and the right has developed its own weird set of buzzwords and vocabularies to shut down any kind of, or to politicize every kind of terminology that climate change justice has come up with. So part of the task for me of translation, it's not unrelated, and it's something that, you know, I began to think about in the context of a book called Unexceptional Politics, which was an attempt to work with a vocabulary of non-classical political theory terms. But I never wanted to distance it too much from the politics of protest, from the politics of contesting the captation in the public sphere of climate change discourses through climate denial discourses.
Yeah, really interesting. Antonia, Anna, any thoughts on this? also from your perspective as, you know, I'm also in literary and cultural studies, so I recognize a lot of the shifts that Emily has described, and you know, how there's a concern about, you know, being in a privileged enclave where certain problems are, you know, that's our big difficulty, sort of making a case for the importance of our contribution while also interrogating our own position of privilege. But it might already look different if we slightly shift our disciplinary angle, I guess.
I can speak back just briefly to the question about vulnerable communities. I mean, I don't have an enormous amount of expertise in the area, but in the area of the Amazon that I worked in, what's happened is that there was this decimation of indigenous peoples in the Amazon by slave traders, then robber barons, then missionaries, then to a certain extent, in a different mode, NGOs and anthropologists who come into a sort of form of cultural appropriation. And there has been a really concerted attempt to reappropriate those spaces. And so what's interesting about the kind of archaeology of interventions, let's say, within this particular area of the Amazon, is there are now indigenous run schools that train indigenous students in things that indigenous people think are important that people learn. And they're trying to be articulated in as far as they need to be to national curriculum and national kind of systems. But what they've done is they've taken a tool of their oppression and they've appropriated it. And that has been facilitated by different people. And it's meant that now also there are indigenous students going to universities for in the last kind of decade or so, quotas have been introduced and there are indigenous students going to universities. So I don't know, the history of that particular region is one where you can't just suddenly pretend that there hasn't always been this history of colonialism and violent oppression and this kind of top-down pressure, but there can be a sense of like facilitating the appropriation and the reappropriation of those systems for self-determination. So it's not a kind of sui generis self-determination, and it will never be, but there are ways in which you can allow for those kinds of practices to flourish, even in these kinds of like, violent colonized landscapes. And just on that, just speaking back to the question about biology and science more generally within environmental, these kinds of environmental questions. I'm not sure I totally understand the question, because I think that biologists and scientists have been consulted a lot around what climate crisis is. But in terms of the kinds of dialogues we might want to nurture across the disciplines, there's a project that you might want to look at, which is Anna Singh's work on, they've just produced that feral atlas, but she's been working for a really long time on kind of the Anthropocene, and she explicitly tries to bring in different forms of scientific expertise and scientists so that they can create a kind of dialogue with each other that is neither one nor the other. And she's done a lot of like thinking around how you'd create those interfaces in a way that wouldn't be reductionist, which is what often happens in conversations with scientists, as I sort of tried to point out in my talk, but also that wouldn't just be completely critical and deconstructivist as well. I think the question is whether it succeeds or not. It's kind of up to you to decide. The interdisciplinary work that I've been involved in, it's always the process that is more fertile than the product. That might be something to do with me. But in any case, that's somewhere you could look to see how humanities-inspired social scientists are thinking about these kinds of dialogues.
Thank you.
If I can just add to that, I was also going to recommend Anna Singh and that project more broadly in some of the publications that come out of it. But the project I brought up, Airborne, led by Mette Hansen and our colleagues, also gave rise to several publications that I think discuss some of these interdisciplinary, problems of interdisciplinary translation in really interesting ways, and sort of attempt to bridge the gaps, if you like. I think it's always a difficult balance to strike for any of us who work in these sorts of areas where there is an advocacy element and there's a scientific engagement with science, engagement with politics, where we have to speak to different audiences. And even the same person as in us as writers may be meaning very different things when we use the very same words. So it's a linguistically very complex space to be in, but nevertheless, we need to nurture that sort of diversity and that, build those sort of bridges. And once you add linguistic translation across languages to the translation across disciplines, it becomes a whole lot more complex.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll come back to many of these points, of course. And also I saw that there was a question about sort of the health and well-being of communities and how that can be achieved. So I also would suggest that maybe we come back to that as well, because we've got 2 further presentations lined up. I'm asking my co-organizer, Andrew Barry, whether, Andrew, would you like to take over for while as chair? As you wish, of course. We do this very informally, as you can see.
I'm happy for you to continue, as you've got a handle on it, Florian, if that's okay.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
So I'll introduce, well, we've introduced all our speakers very briefly at the beginning, but I'll now invite Federico Federici from University College London to speak about his work. Please, Federico, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, let me share with you my screen. And whilst I do that, Florian, is it showing?
Yes.
Thank you very much. So thank you for inviting me. And I have to be honest, I believe that the questions nicely introduced my paper, because one of the ways to link up what has been said before by colleagues and what I'm going to talk about in terms of the project that I would like to introduce to you is a link around pragmatic disruption. So this project is about translating the United Nations disaster risk reduction terminology. So an English language terminology created in the very context that Emily was describing before, as often dictating narratives, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm making my own framing of that aspect. And one of the choices that I made very early on was to give you an ambiguous title, and translating hazard, you can read it both ways, as in the terminology effort that we were doing in translating discussion, debates, and terms relating to research in disaster risk reduction through the lenses of different languages, as well as the risk and dangers of translating hazards. And I would argue that in my entire research career, the focus has always been on translation of regionalized or marginal languages, with all the different caveats that those definitions involve. But one of the aspects that has always been almost dogmatic in me is that I don't want to accept that this challenge cannot be won. There are solutions to translation actions, there are interventions, there are levels of advocacy that could happen through translation when we engage on trying to resolve what appears to be as impossible translation choices through possible solutions. I'm not saying that the solutions are necessarily found, and I'm not saying that the ones that we're going to discuss today are good solutions. Sorry, I'm having some instability issues with my internet connection. I would like to double check that you can hear me.
Yeah, we can.
Oh, thank you. So one of the privileges of being part of this panel is also to close the circle. What I'm going to discuss today through the lenses of a project that we finished last Friday, and so the results of which are going to be analyzed in the coming months, is also the end of a journey that started on the 2nd of August 2015 at the British School in Rome, at the time in presence in the lovely buildings that host today's virtual event. And that particular day, we were laying the foundations with Sharon O'Brien on the research around crisis translation. So the role of translation in emergency and disaster crisis communication. That particular project became in 2017 the International Network for Crisis Translation. And through that Interact network, we focused on a number of issues around training translators operating in rare language combinations. They may not have access to professional or academic training in those in their own languages. And the second aspect was trying to induce or at least influence policy changes when it comes to humanitarian response, the international humanitarian sector, but also more broadly, any sector intervening in disaster research. It was a big ask, and we're not saying that we've done anything else than chip away on the big questions that were asked also by the audiences already. But one of the aspects that emerged was the attention that our project created in two early career researchers based in Sierra Leone, who in November 2020 contacted me to provide some coordination and collaboration in training translators in a number of languages of the Sierra Leonean multilingual context. So today, what I'm going to discuss with you very briefly is the position of terminology about hazards in the United Nations disaster risk reduction, because that terminology has been the center of attention of our translators and of our projects now for 9 months. And the connection between that particular terminology and the issue of risk reduction and preparedness as perceived through the lenses of access to funds, access to information, access to equal opportunities to bid for research grants as well as developmental grants. Because as you will know, but I will try to briefly reconnect for you, the connection between risk reduction and developmental efforts has been one of the dominant agenda of many international organizations, especially those rotating around the United Nations various entities. And one of the outcomes of our project so far, and one that seems to be very important from the perspective that we were taking about policy influence, is that we seem to have had a bit of success in changing and shifting the policy landscape in Sierra Leone when it comes to including different language communities. Now, the United Disaster Risk Reduction terminology is the offspring, so to speak, of the activities of the Sendai framework around disaster risk reduction. This framework was a major agreement on the developmental agenda, as much as a monitoring mechanism to see how much developing countries, I hate that expression, but this is the focus of the particular framework, how much countries developing new economical resources and developing new approaches to their own self-definitions are affected in terms of climate change, but also in terms of reducing the impact that not only climate change, but also natural hazards can have on the local population. Now, this particular framework is focused a lot on monitoring changes, so monitoring and measuring improvement of practices and their effectiveness. So one of the very core elements of it is that the core concepts that are formulated in English and that were part of extremely long and convoluted terminological debates and are a compromise from different disciplines and different perspectives mean that now hazards is defined within this context and is relevant for accessing funding, for bidding for resources in terms of a process, a phenomenon, a human activity that may cause loss of life, injury and other health impacts, property damage, social and economic disruption, or environmental degradation. Now, that particular definition is often crucial in trying to organize and frame a project in terms of improving the social resilience, improving the community-led preparedness activities, and is also intending to monitor community engagement, so participatory practices among people who may be affected by the risk caused by climate change and increased impact of social natural hazards. Now, all of that clashes, though, with the fact that not only these concepts have been often formulated in the global north, and so they refer to referential systems that maybe sometimes seem to be constrained by at least the use of one global language of dissemination, the scientific English. But that is not enough. Those particular definitions may be standards, but the perception of risk, so anything that goes with risk reduction, is in fact culture-based, and our reaction to risk, our perception of risk, is influenced by our cultural beliefs, our belief systems, our education, and all of the other factors that define us as individuals and also as members of groups and social organizations. So we cannot distinguish those two. And yet we expect to be able to translate a paradigm that is created and presented in English and officially in the United Nations is also translated in the other 6 languages that are the official languages of the UN. Now, is that enough? Of course, it's not enough. And one of the troublesome areas is, in fact, monitoring community engagement with risk reduction principles. And those were the very questions that started this project. And I'll describe very quickly the aims, but also importantly, the partners who are at the central and at the very core of this project, because they are the actors that want to create change and disruption within the given system. So it's one way of appropriating, if you want, the United Nations disaster risk reduction terminology and make it relevant for the local population. It might be, if there is enough time, I will try to give you the context because it's highly significant as it's building on real experiences of disaster risk reduction and response. And I would like to close my observations emphasizing the potential for future change within Sierra Leone. So Jonas and Pius are in fact the initiator of the project. Jonas initially contacted me because YMCA in Sierra Leone was planning to develop a disaster risk reduction dictionary that would advocate for multilingualism by providing information, access to information around the terminologies regularly used by developmental organizations, both national, international, NGOs, when it comes to allocating funds, bidding for resources. And at the same time, the terminology around disaster risk reduction is becoming important in terms of education and training and participatory activities with young people. But I have to thank Jonas and Pius because their work ethics has been a real learning experience for me, the ways in which they manage time, people, and at the same time, some underlying tensions within the different language communities that represent often different geopolitical entities within Sierra Leone, and as well differences that were exacerbated just up to 10 years ago, 20 years ago with the Civil War. So we worked with Kono, Creole, Limba, Mende, and Temne speakers to produce the terminology. The idea was also to create terminological resources that could be usable by disaster managers operating among communities that speak these languages. And here is important to add a very quick note. Those disaster managers are themselves bilingual people who use those languages. And so there is a very active element in their decision to integrate their knowledge from disaster risk reduction research and their role in supporting population, local groups, local communities that speak their own languages. And then ultimately, it's supposed to be a project about linguistic equality. So through the terminology, through understanding what those terms are regularly thrown at different community groups, or different participatory training activities, what they mean in their own language, what they could mean in their own experience of the world, was an important element, because I firmly believe that even though translation may be impossible and may be in some cases multi-referential, multi-thematic, is still an act that allows better communication, that absence of discussion, which is the problem when English is supposed to be the main language as it is in Sierra Leone. But in reality, that language is officially the language of the country, is not regularly spoken. So this particular translation project was, I think, possibly borrowing in part Anna Laura's definition. It is a form of embedded activism, as many of our participants were in fact members of disaster management agencies within Sierra Leone. So with the initiator YMCA, this project clearly bridges the requirements of the disaster risk reduction agenda with those of the developmental programs. So the project received funding from the UNDP. But at the same time, what was very important for us was that early in November, we joined forces with the newly established National Disaster Management Agency that actually started its official functions in November 2020. And with them and the Office for National Security and the support of Brook de Wielt, we have created a partnership among different stakeholders that are all actively involved in representing the voices of the different language communities. And the next phase will be continuing the collaboration with the International Federation of Translators and Interpreters to make sure that in the next 2 years, the critical mass has been created around languages that don't have professional and professionally trained translators to develop their own associations, to develop their own resources. Now, it is important to understand that whilst translating this particular terminology from English into these languages, our translators did not have access to any dictionary. There was only access to their language expertise. And therefore, it had to be a project about collaboration. So I'm skimming very quickly through crucial points in the recent history of Sierra Leone that are fundamentally important for the project. I'm not going to in any way suggest that these are important to understand 60 years of life in Sierra Leone, but they're clearly points that have created an additional need for creating disruption, creating forms that allow rural communities and specific language communities to better understand their positions within the country. So after having regained independence from the UK in 1961, the country remained one of the diamond exporters, remained partially unstable, and the civil war that took place between 1991 and 2002 created the incredible conflict and tension. So one of the subtext of our translation work was also to make sure that collaboration across the different language groups during the training sessions would be about increasing understanding, not only about the individual terms, but also their impact on the different communities within Sierra Leone. And that was not always easy during the sessions. And one of the additional constraints was that even though these tensions were always there, the necessity for overcoming the extreme poverty that has come as the aftermath of the conflict, and the necessity to work within the now reconstructed and reconstructing national infrastructure also meant making sure that the multilingual context is not ignored, making sure that out of the 8 million residents of Sierra Leone, and the 28 languages still recognized as being spoken within the country, with 23 being widely spoken, at least there is an understanding that this multilingual context reflects not just tribal divisions, but actual diversity in language, in expression, in self-identification through their linguistic identity, their cultural identity, their recognition within the geographical areas of origin. And those would be all ignored if all of the information about rural sustainable projects, development in rural areas were to come as an English packaged way of programming development, way of reconstructing infrastructures. in addition to that, there's also the element of a very weak healthcare system, one that is still improving. And so at the beginning of this project, of course, the idea that COVID-19 messages and the need for translating those messages so that different communities could accept them was still very much steeped into the experience of the Ebola epidemic. So it's not the case, therefore, that Translators Without Borders, an NGO that works in the crisis translation sector, an NGO that, with all the limitations of any NGOs in the world, tries to provide volunteer services to different communities, produced a new map of the languages that are absolutely necessary for communicating efficiently with different language communities in Sierra Leone at the end of 2020. If we look at those language distributions, which is pretty accurate if you double cross it with the Glotlog data, the reality is that the main language may be English, but the spoken language is the Creole that doesn't necessarily resemble English and does not give access to, again, applying for funds in English. So what do we have? We have the experience of the Ebola epidemic that clearly displayed mistrust, not so much on the content of the science, but on the messengers. And the lack of culturally appropriate messaging in Ebola has been recognized as one of the crucial cascading effects of the initial epidemic. So after the emergency had gone and the resources were in place to support the local population, lack of access to information in a way that was trusted and relied upon by the local population meant that cultural and linguistic obstacles created additional damage to the population in terms of death, in terms of morbidity, in terms of issues that continued to affect Sierra Leone in 2021. So we were not surprised to receive a lot of interest within 2 weeks, and we recruited 50 translators for initial basic training. And those 50 initial participants included bilingual volunteers, but also they were recruited among the National Disaster Management Agency. They were recruited among institutional members affiliated with crisis management regional offices, because the idea was that they would be better able to embed an appropriate and assimilated version of disaster risk reduction in community-led initiatives within the Kono, Creole, Limba, Mende, and Temne-speaking communities. So this was absolutely crucial. And of course, you can see also students from the university, they felt an element of advocacy in sharing their linguistic skills, sharing their bilingualism in terms of this project. The translations, as I mentioned, were finished on Friday. We completed the final revisions, and we attempted to recreate within the limitations of lack of professional personnel, lack of resources in terms of multilingual resources, all of the best practices that are normally used within the translation industry. So not only collaborative translation, but also senior revisers, language experts who would double check the quality of the translations. And ultimately, we would like to go on and continue with the next phase by doing a sort of reception study of the translation acceptability within the language communities. So rather than accepting the quality of translation in abstract as a context that could work within a globalization and localization industry, we would like to recognize acceptance within the communities themselves. Now, drawing to a conclusion, I think that one of the best examples that I could give you about the significance of this particular project is around the need for translating vulnerability. Vulnerability is such a key paradigmatic term to access resources and access support that at the same time reflects the impossibility not only of translating, that's a given, but also the impossibility of adopting minimalistic conceptual definitions of vulnerability as a multi-factor element. If we look at the definition in English, the conditions determined by physical, social, economic, environmental factors, processes which create a susceptibility of an individual community assets or systems to the impact of hazards, there is an attempt to be cumulatively comprehensive in all the factors that affect vulnerability. But vulnerability as a concept itself is explained through a noun, does not correspond to a noun in any of the 5 languages. Furthermore, it cannot be explained without reference to individual conditions. And so the condition of vulnerability is in itself embodied semantically in the causes of vulnerability itself. And another fantastic example from the revisions work that we were doing was the observation by one of the senior revisers of Kono. I cannot use 2 different terms for hazards and disasters. Now, in the world of disaster risk reduction, hazards trigger disasters, but that is a very Anglo-centric simplified definitions that I've given you, but one that influences a lot of the research. But in Kono, it can only be described in multiple words, and that's fine. But kaza means something that will cause a disaster to come. And imisa can also mean the event itself, of the after effects of the event. So how can they use the translation of the disaster risk reduction terminology to their advantage to recognize vulnerability as a combination that is undividable from its conditions, just as disasters cannot be separated in Kono in some of the languages from the causes of the disasters, from the triggers, what we would call triggers. That was another interesting term, impossible to translate. So what we achieved was this collaboration with the National Disaster Management Agency. In the end, 50 translators completed the final versions of the terminology. 11 of them, quite well distributed across the languages, came from the National Disaster Management Agency. Within the Interact project, we suggested that integrating language, consideration about mediation in terms of language differences should come as part of a disaster risk reduction tools. This agency is embedding linguistic diversity within its practices. And we hope that maybe what I've tried to summarize in this diagram, the fact that access to the knowledge, the data, the facts that is essential to understand and respond to climate change will in turn, at least within the NDMA actions and the creation of the enthusiasm around translating to support to local communities by local communities members, will create translation, interpreting, and multimodal accessibility that are necessary in general terms, but particularly needed, particularly welcomed by the different language communities in Sierra Leone. And I didn't use the colonized, so I'm very happy to use it here. It was introduced by Pius, it was introduced by the local translators. They wanted to decolonize research methods, they wanted to decolonize the terminology that affects them in terms of accessing participatory activities, and in terms of educating young generations that want to fight climate change in their own understanding of climate hazards, and without forgetting that there is a possibility of integrating different paradigms. So I still believe the translation in and out of local languages is key to participation in these community-led processes. And I believe the YMCA in Sierra Leone has just demonstrated to us that it can be done.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Federico. That was fascinating. Actually, some of the things that you talked about in the final part of your talk brought back to my mind discussions which we had a bit more than a week ago with the historians who spoke at the second panel about conceptions of crisis and you know, the peculiar temporality of crisis and catastrophe, and what it means to be expecting a catastrophe, or what it means to be sort of living through a period of crisis, and how that is clearly something which is at the center of our difficulties of responding to environmental degradation and ecocide and climate, global heating, but it's also something which is changed so much across periods and cultures. So I'm personally very interested to what extent you feel that the sort of the idea of crisis communication or sort of crisis prevention is itself potentially, you know, interestingly problematic framework to think about the Anthropocene. But that's a question, I guess, to our debate. Before we get there, I would now like to welcome our fifth and final speaker, who is Loredana Polezzi, who will, I think, come back to some of the issues that have been raised by you, Federico, and by many others. Loredana, over to you, please.
Thank you, Florian. And let me see if I can share my screen, most of all, because I have nothing as beautiful as Federico's presentation, Florian, but I can at least share some images. So let me do that. It should now go to the full presentation. Here we go. You can see that? Yes. Okay. So thank you again for the invitation, and thank you for what has been a phenomenal range of presentations this morning, which, amongst other things, shows us how multitudinous translation can be, and how diverse translational phenomena are, but also our approaches to it. I very much share Federico's feeling there, and I kept thinking of Paolo Fabbri, the Italian semiotiction's sentence about translators being like bumblebees. If you look at the laws of physics, he used to say they should not be flying, but they do so all the time. So in that spirit, I will be talking about linguistic ecologies and about translational thinking. I want to start by bringing some specific examples taken again from a particular project that I was part of. And then I will be moving to some reflections on theoretical models of translation and also their ethical implications, and finish again with a different kind of example. But first of all, I am joining you from Long Island, so let me acknowledge that I am speaking from the stolen land of the Settlecott people, Walford, also known as Stony Brook. And let me also acknowledge that, as Antonia said before, well, the work that I'll be talking about is very much collaborative work. It would not exist without collaboration. And I wish that the colleagues in the UK, in Australia, in Namibia, in Zambia, and elsewhere who were involved in the thinking that took me here were here with me. I'm speaking on their behalf, but I very much hope that they join us. Now, the projects that I'm referring to were one, the Transnationalizing Modern Languages and its extension, in particular, the TML Global Challenges project, which started as a way of looking at modern languages, and that tainted label and tainted discipline. Again, Emily was talking about, of course, of Spivak and death of a discipline. Modern languages are as tainted as comparative literature, maybe even more. And we're trying to think transnationally and translationally beyond what has been defined as the methodological nationalism of that field, but also beyond what Anne-Marie Fortier in particular has called the citizenization of language, the way in which monolingualism in particular gets attached to the nation state and becomes part of the nation state apparatus for deciding who's a citizen, who's a good citizen, and so on. And then the partnerships here took us very deep and sometimes in unexpected ways into co-designing and co-researching, and also towards some of the areas that Anna and Federico and others have spoken about, embedding some of this work into forms of activism and into forms of action. The other project that we worked in using with was the Phoenix project, which is led by Cardiff University, where I was at the time. And this, again, was very much about embedding our work transdisciplinarily across the humanities and the medical field in particular, but also thinking very deeply about how we work with local gatekeepers. And local gatekeepers meant universities, so the University of Namibia in particular, and then also the University of Zambia, but also gatekeepers in terms of, for instance, precisely health professionals who are the people who find themselves in the field doing some of the mediating. So through these projects, we started to think about the way in which the lack of attention to language and to translation raises important, crucial issues, especially in the context of minoritized languages, and especially in developing contexts, but not exclusively. And I've put here this image, which was taken last year in the middle of the BLM demonstrations, because to me, this is this particular sign held up by a young woman in the US points towards the importance of the reflections about language and the reflection on the constantly fraught and constantly fought over issue of language as part of the bigger questions of decolonization, as we have been already saying this morning, and all the related areas. But to begin with, as I said, of talking of Namibia, let me tell you a quick story, an anecdote which I have often used with students and with colleagues and with health professionals to explain what those fraught issues of translation may be and how they go beyond the question of, well, I think working with health professionals, the thing that they always immediately latched on to was, oh, we don't have the technical terminology, for instance, in the indigenous languages in order to speak about our professional knowledge, which goes very much back to the question of equivocation and the question of perspective that Antonia in particular was talking about before. The woman you see in that picture is Teresa Chiveira, a Namibian doctor, a speaker of Rukungali, one of the indigenous languages of Namibia. And she told us a story of how, as she was doing a specialist training, as she's a specialist in anesthesia, she was shadowing a doctor who was not Namibian until the medical school in Namibia was founded only 6 years ago. So until very recently, all doctors had to be either expats or Namibians who had studied elsewhere. She was shadowing an expat doctor and noticed that he was not prescribing, apart from immediately after surgical interventions, he was not prescribing any pain medication. Eventually, she challenged him, and the answer in his words, in English, of course, came back as, these people do not feel pain. Now, there's a lot of work that has been done on the question of translation of pain, but that was for Teresa herself as a doctor, not as a specialist in translation, an alarm bell and a moment of recognition that said to her that something was being missed here precisely in terms of translational processes which go beyond language and are deeply embedded in cultural behavior. And again, the different perspectives and the points of view that we've been talking about this morning are important here. Now, Namibia, and why Namibia? A little bit of data there, a large, very vast area, small population. But in terms of linguistic ecologies, again, as in the example of Sierra Leone that Federico gave us, but differently, of course, because each case is also locally different. A very complex linguistic ecology that we can describe in terms of linguistic superdiversity. In terms of language policies and language politics, there is a tension between an intention, a goodwill to maintain heritage, and on the other hand, what famously Alistair Pennycook named as the myth of English, the idea that English will take the country out of poverty, that English can take us all into modernity. And there are very strong, at this particular moment, social and generational dimensions to this complex linguistic landscape, because Namibia was independent in 1990, so you have 3 generations. You have the older people who speak at least one indigenous language, maybe more than one, will speak Afrikaans and may have some German. You have the people who are now adults, especially in the professional world, they will also have English, but they still maintain an indigenous language, possibly more, some Afrikaans learned in the street, though not always at school. And then you have the born frees, for whom English is becoming the main language. And they still have, for instance, passive knowledge of indigenous languages, but increasingly are losing the ability to use it. And we had colleagues and people we met in the field who were constantly saying to us, I want my children to speak English because that will give them access to the professions. But on the other hand, it's so sad, my children no longer have the means to speak to their grandparents. So that's the kind of tension that we encounter there. This is the distribution according to the latest 2 census reports, 2001, 2011. You can see the distribution. And you can see this there among the indigenous languages, Oshiwambo is by far the most common, but there are substantial other minoritized languages, so doubly minoritized if you want. And the distribution, again, for some of them is local, but for a lot of them is across the country. And of course, there are also languages which belong to nomadic cultures there. Now, when it comes to issues of development, and the way in which we think about these ecologies of language in terms of policies and politics and social cohesion and so on, what is extremely interesting is that you can do that exercise. I'm not going to do it here because of issues of time, but you can take the question of linguistic diversity and accessibility and inclusivity and attach it to every single one of the SDGs. And yet, you look at the SDG documents, there is nothing there really that talks about language. There is nothing there that explicitly talks about translation. Antonia told us earlier, where are the budgets? Well, that's an area that myself and a number of colleagues in the UK have tried to pick up, if not with the UN, but we're trying on that front too, but certainly with the funding bodies in the UK, for instance, with UKRI, the AHRC. How can we, and of course, I'm not going to go there, the UK government has recently cut dramatically its funding for foreign aid, but even when it was at its best, let's say it this way, the issue of attention to language was always somehow obscured, was somehow opaque, was never in the foreground. So at one point, I remember with one of the colleagues talking about the fact that we were trying in our own institutions, in looking at our own research practices, to have forms for ethical approval of research, for instance, changed. Someone was asking earlier, what can we do? Well, for instance, there should be a question there that says, okay, you're going to work wherever, in Sierra Leone, in Namibia, in the UK, for that matter, because the UK hospital is one of the most multilingual environments you will encounter in the world, and the same goes for the US, of course. What are the processes, the procedures, and where is the budget line that you are sort of setting aside for language practices and multiple language offerings, for instance? So one of the key notions that we came up with as part of this collaborative project was the idea of language indifference, and of how we can combat, how we can go against language indifference. And by language indifference, what I mean is precisely this idea of a transparency of language, of not paying attention to language, of across the sciences, but across the social sciences and the humanities as well, pretending almost that translation is transparent, that language is a pane of glass. Now, and on the other hand, what we were trying to promote is the idea of linguistic awareness and sensitization, starting from our own research practices and stressing the fact that language is never singular, that language is always plural, and also language is always fraught, is always a place of tension. But also, again, as Federico was saying, we're not going to chuck it in. We are not going to accept defeat. We want to continue to work in that fraught area. This is a picture taken inside a classroom at the University of Namibia. And the question that these students were asked, these are not students of languages, they're medical students, I think, or they may have been media students at the time, was how many people in here speak more than 4 languages, or 4 languages or more. So we had a context of multilingualism in action, and we were, by the way, taking a lot of this back also to European context, where very often multilingualism is silenced and indeed minoritized. I was working from Wales, and we were very conscious of that. We were trying to work on the question of sensitization in terms of shifting from a viewpoint in which language and translation is perceived as a problem to be solved. One of the first questions you ask all the time is, can you solve this problem? It is actually costly. It is time consuming. Can you give us, again, I always think of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the Babel fish, the universal translator, whether it is science fiction or at present AI, can you give us something that will make this go away? So we were trying to shift that because, by the way, the problem to be solved is also a question of resources. And even with AI, the amount of resources that's being spent in the big fish languages is huge at present. But when you come to indigenous languages, very little is being done. So again, it's not a problem that will be solved soon. We were trying to move from that to a viewpoint in which we're thinking about the wealth of languages, language-rich cultures, and precisely what that language richness means in terms of how we can enrich our ways of knowing, our ways of thinking, our epistemologies, our approaches, and our inclusivity. And we were also thinking about language as the ultimate intangible heritage. So in ecological terms, we may not have an item, a physical item that we're trying to preserve, but we're thinking about the intangible heritage attached to language. We were working with future doctors, with trainee doctors, but we're also working with children who are also future doctors. And as I was saying earlier, may actually already be part of their families, their parents may be part of this idea of a myth of English, which sees them as future doctors only if they can become English speakers, fluent English speakers. And we were adopting a model which is that of train the trainer. So the idea is that you can train people who will then cascade that down. The code word, as I said, was sensitization. And the other key element here was moving away from the deficit model. I'll give you two examples of this. One was a medical dictionary. When we arrived, one of the colleagues was in the midst of preparing a dictionary of medical terms in Oshiwambo. His initial starting point was that of a gap, a lack. These terms are not available in Oshiwambo. We want to make them available to doctors who speak that language. But what became apparent in our discussions and talking about translation in a less mechanical way is, what's the point of translating technical terminology? Because the doctors are indeed trained in English. The people who need translation are the patients. And for those patients, what is important is understanding, again, the equivocations, the slippage, the points of contact between the indigenous forms of knowledge and what is labeled as scientific medical terminology. And for me, one of the things I started doing was getting people to draw their own maps of languages on translation. And this is one of my favorite ones from a student, a medical student at UNAM, who I won't stop on this, but if you look at it, what I find fantastically interesting is that this maps move from English to Afrikaans to Proto-Gobab if you work in the traditional Western way of reading, let's say. But then this person stopped and renumbered these labels 1, 2, 3, the other way around, possibly in terms of their personal importance to themselves. Now, we've continued to work together, and we continue to work in ways that are as much as we can. And this is always a fraught area, an area in which you have to step back and think all the time about what you're doing and about mechanisms of exclusion and our own biases and our own sort of black spots. But we continue to work in collaborative ways and also moving the collaborative way, working directly to collaborative translation. So the latest project we undertook was the translation of My Hero Is You, which is a storybook for children meant to help parents and educators to work on young children's mental health during the COVID pandemic. And we have worked with students and colleagues who are speakers of these languages, Oshiwambo, Xerero, Kopukoab, Bukwangali, and Silozi, very much giving them the driving seat in translating the storybook into these languages. Now, all of this for me is part of thinking about translation in partly different ways. And this is where my thinking is very much influenced by, but also and connects to what Emily was talking about at the beginning of this session, the idea of untranslatability, which I tend to talk about and to think about very much with her definition of untranslatability. But as she said, people have often misread that in terms of we cannot translate. There is no perfect translation, therefore we can't translate. So I am thinking about this in terms of going against perfect translation. So translation I see very much as the fabric of our lives. I do this exercise with students again, or with trainees, take away everything in your life, in your urban environment, in your everyday practices that would not be possible if it weren't for processes of translation, intralingual, interlingual, and so on, and what is left there. So translational thinking and translational ethics, for me, are about moving away from a notion of ethics as substitution and erasure. So, you know, you erase what was there before and find a perfect synonym, again, as we were saying earlier, which implies erasing the existing. And instead, it's about the idea of co-presence and trace. So you maintaining but transforming. And there's a trace, there's an inscription there. That is a piece of linen from a friend, an artist, the Amore. It belonged to her grandmother, and it's inscribed with her initials, and it was transported across the ocean. I want to give you a final, to close, I'm going to close in 2 minutes, Florian, if that's okay. I want to give you a final example, which is taken from the work of an Australian-Italian artist, Filomena Coppola, who works very much with cloth, with embroidery, with multiple techniques, and works very much with notions of translation. But also, this will take me to the environmental dimension of translation. This is a piece of one of her recent works, which is called, it was part of a global collaborative project called COVID-19 Quilt. And this is a triptych in which she sees embroidered images of the earth representing continuity in the face of the unexpected. And for her, the attractiveness of embroidery comes from its decorative as well as functional nature, but also from its connection with time, to the use of and changes to and deterioration which occur with cloth and with embroidery during time. And it's precisely this sensitivity to use, to change, and to deterioration, which I want to concentrate here to unpick the notion of trace and its connection to translation and its implication for a translational ethics, which may take us beyond the human as well and also embrace the environment. This is another work by Filomena that we see here called Mirror Lorem, which was exhibited in 2011 at the Rio Vista Cellar Basement Mildura Art Center as part of the Mildura biennial exhibition. And its installation occupied an entire room in an old colonial house and consisted of 2 elements: a wall-mounted pastel on paper drawing, which combines an image of a native orchid with a luxuriant motif from a William Morris wallpaper, and then an intricate rug made of layers of Mildura dirt and Murray River sand, also reproducing that wallpaper motif. And that covers the whole room. And the choices of material is important here. On the one hand, it underscores the ecological theme of the installation, and on the other, the colonial memory and decolonial context for it. Once we consider use, change, and deterioration, the reading of the work becomes even more complex, throwing into relief the ecological as well as the ethical dimension attached to notions of trace and of translation as trace. So in order to see the drawing that is hanging on the far wall of the room, visitors had to enter it, cross the floor, and in doing so, both leave their trace on the carpet that covered it and destroy its delicate image. Though the materials which made up the floor were not precious, many hesitated before stepping into the room. But eventually, the tracing began, and the floor pattern was replaced by a multitude of footprints, until only at the edges of the floor, a few traces of the initial pattern remained visible. In its interaction with an interrogation of its audience, the installation materializes in front of our eyes, or for the visitors under their feet, the fact that no act, not even the act of viewing, is neutral and innocuous. Our presence leaves traces, and those traces alter their environment in ways which both change and deteriorate it. Yet traces also work backwards. They tell the story and hold the memory, in this case in the form of physical imprints, of an event, a series of acts, and testify to their consequences. Now, for me, I see this as a model of translation which is not based on perfect equivalence, substitution, and erasure, a model which is doomed to fail, as Ricoeur, among others, observed, but on trace and on co-presence. This kind of translation doesn't aim to erase difference, but rather to keep its trace and to keep it as trace. It is not necessarily harmonious, not neatly linear, but it leaves a trace of our existence and a testimony of being and intervening in the world. It forms a piece of our narrative rather than imposing an erasure that requires us to abandon who and what we were, becoming something and someone else. And in this sense, translation, while not neatly traceable back to any presumed origin or original text, is a guarantor of narrative continuity, however hidden or fragmented that might be. Translation enters our space and makes us see its porosity. That porosity and permeability also reminds us that no boundary can contain us and no wall can protect us. The imperfect translatability of our world, with its inherent tensions, echoes the need to act both locally and globally at all times, and to pay attention to the multiple ecologies, linguistic, cultural, environmental, in which we're inscribed. As Emily said at the start, far from discouraging translation, untranslatability, that is, the impossibility of perfect translation, demands further acts of translating and reminds us of the ethical imperative inscribed in its equally irreducible and creative difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are, again, a lot of very important points that take us right back to the beginning of today's session, but also take us back to some of the previous sessions. And I love the images of the artwork that you showed, and I know how it was very sort of, I think, in the context of our series, a very poignant reminder also of the importance of cultural interventions and the sort of serendipity of cultural interventions in all this. And I don't mean just sort of art practice, but I also mean our awareness, very much in line with what Emily said, of sort of ourselves as political agents who pay particular attention to register and to modes of expression. So thank you very much. Questions are beginning to appear on the Q&A. I will now hand over to Andrew, who has the wonderful but also very difficult task of sort of responding and sharing the Q&A and wrapping up. Andrew, thank you.
Well, thanks to everyone. I mean, I can't. I'm going to speak briefly because I'd like to hear more from the speakers and also from the Q&A. I should say very briefly that I suppose I would describe myself as a political geographer who does ethnographic work, but perhaps unlike most of the speakers, my ethnographic work is within dominant scientific and institutions. In other words, I'm precisely concerned with the ways in which putatively global languages are produced very locally, in which the issue of translation exists as a kind of absent presence, which is continually not mentioned or denied, and is only kind of an afterthought, in which issues of the non-translation of texts can be rather crucial, and the timing of the translation of texts, or the kind of summary of texts, can be kinds of rather crucial in the exercise of power, or the exclusion of certain communities and so forth. But these issues are not addressed. But I don't want to talk about my own work, but just sort of pick up kind of three themes. One which, to reiterate what I think a number of people, perhaps everybody has said, is really, I think, a kind of powerful theme of moving beyond the idea of, as Loredana put it, of perfect translation, or of a kind of notion that one can have kind of an instantaneous translation between languages, in which English can be translated to other languages in a kind of in a direct relation. But neither, of course, translation happens. It has to happen in some kind of way. So one was then concerned with the kind of concern with the histories and politics of imperfect translations, or translations between languages which themselves have already become hybrid and therefore not fully incommensurable, but in which untranslatability can be considered a value as well as rather than an obstacle. And I think that's a kind of powerful theme, which actually is something which a lot of institutions, as well as, of course, academic ones, can really, have not yet begun to take on board. I suppose there is a kind of a more kind of narrowly academic question, which I think was part of the kind of starting point Florian and my conversation about this, which is the kind of question of anthropology and its relation to comparative literature and the relationship between social sciences and humanities, and the kind of asymmetry between the ways in which languages have become virtually invisible in the social sciences outside of anthropology, and the question of translation is then a kind of purely kind of technical matter, and yet, of course, within the disciplines of literature, that non-European languages are extraordinarily marginal. So there's a kind of extraordinary asymmetry there, which we might have to grapple with. I think there's also potential here in terms of a kind of conceptual conversation, and Emily indicated the kind of proliferation of terms, particularly in relation to environment and climate, which is happening, some of which are taking terms from non-European languages. Others indicate the kind of issue, such as Spivak's notion of planetarity, and the many attempts to kind of rethink the concept of the Anthropocene. But I wanted to kind of just end by thinking about, you know, turning back to climate change and the kind of question of the political situation within which we are, and the kind of its specificity. Of course, you know, historically, perhaps, and I'm certainly not an expert in this area, the question of translation has been understood in terms of some sort of synchronic comparison between kind of national spaces or national languages, kind of, whereas we're dealing now with an extraordinarily kind of dynamic is not the word for it, a kind of a crisis situation, a kind of a situation in movement, in which issues such as the geopolitics of the relationship between different languages are shifting, of course. And you know, Anna's discussion of the kind of ways in which climate is addressed within Chinese political discourse is absolutely is an absolutely practical political issue, because it's something which one has to be engaged with due to the very shifting sets of relations there globally. But apart from that, I think one sees crucially the climate change institutions were kind of, if you like, driven for some time by global institutions, global scientists, global scientific models, global climate change models. And we're seeing both the kind of shift in terms of the practical problems which are being considered within climate change discussions. We can only think of, at the moment, the kind of localized kinds of disasters which have to be addressed, not just global climate change models, but also crucially relating to issues of decolonization and environmental justice, which are being raised more forcefully. Now, how much these will figure in the next COP, I don't know, but it's an emerging discussion, and it's something which there is a potential to push the debate. And in a sense, we kind of know the global picture. Climate change scientists have done their best in kind of modeling the global situation. The issues are now absolutely require a much more differentiated response, and one which recognizes multiple constituencies. So this is a different moment where the issue of translation has become, I think, much more central. I mean, having said that, I've said that I did field work within kind of global scientific institutions. As we see all too clearly in relation to COVID, global scientific institutions aren't nearly as global as one might imagine them to be. So there is kind of problems of translation between different cultures of expertise. And the kind of one issue which I'm working on at the moment is global vaccine equity, and the question of the translatability of, if you like, things like kind of testing protocols or quality protocols in relation to vaccines is not an insignificant issue. But most of all, in a way which partly is reflected in calls for a kind of instrumental response. What are the policy implications? What are the practical implications? Is a sense of the urgency of the situation. I mean, I don't think these things are kind of mutually exclusive. I think this kind of discussion is necessary in order to bring together a constituency which can indicate that actually one is dealing in a kind of intervening in a political event, which is open, in which one can't assume we're in a kind of moment in history where we certainly cannot assume any kind of teleological direction of change, in which the question of language is one of many issues which we have to address. I'm going to stop there because I'd like to hear what other people have to say, really, but that's just my brief reflections on the discussion. And people may have questions in the Q&A, or just the panel may want to intervene spontaneously themselves. Thanks everybody.
Thank you, Andrew. Maybe Antonia, Emily, and Anna would like to make themselves visible again. We have one very specific question for, well, it's actually sort of an interesting broad question, but it's presented as a question to Loredana. So what are your thoughts on science popularization, for example, videos explaining scientific concepts in simple terms? Do you think this will play a prominent role in the ecological transition?
Interesting question, and I think that at least Antonia should also answer to this. The problem here again is the question of asymmetry that Andrew just mentioned, and the question of the directionality. Okay, one thing that I didn't say, I have this other image of translation that I like, which is the idea of translation as a ping pong ball. You know, again, is what so many of us have said, going beyond this idea of a binary model of translation, which goes from A to B and stops there. Florian, you were saying it earlier. The question with one of the many problems with that model is that directionality is also a vector of power and force, and there are issues of labor, hidden labor regimes, there are all kinds of things, knowledge regimes inscribed in that. If you start thinking of translation as something much more dynamic, what you have is a ping pong ball that hits somewhere and bounces somewhere else. It bounces off, it bounces in a different direction. It's much more sort of unpredictable and much more dynamic as a process. And I think if we're thinking of popularization, again, popularization from whom to whom, you might think of an awful lot of colonial knowledge management, let's call it like this, and knowledge regimes as forms of popularization, you know, again, the infantilization of colonized populations and so on, and the way in which you sort of popularize by making simpler, by reducing. And it's almost like we are the ones who detain knowledge, and then we're passing on a version of that knowledge that is accessible somehow. It's a question of who's controlling this again. Now, I mentioned, you know, whatever you do, you can't step entirely away from these regimes of knowledge. And so when I was saying, when we were working with Namibia, for instance, we were working with local gatekeepers. We were working with the local university, which was then the intermediary between us and the authorities, but also sort of local associations, populations, school, etc., etc. You have to accept that they have their own agendas as well, and so on. But I think popularization, like all kinds of translation, needs to be multi-directional in a sense. You know, if we're just popularizing what we see as knowledge here where we are, without any attention for these gaps, any attention for these slippages, any attention to these untranslatabilities, or whatever we want to call them, the equivocation, again, to use the word that Antonia was using earlier, then popularization in itself also remains problematic. But that doesn't mean that we stop, you know, that we abdicate from any form of communication. That's the you know, Paolo Fabri's bumblebee paradox. We have to continue to do it. And you know what? We actually do it. We do it all the time. So we can't abdicate from that. But the more awareness we have of the processes and the complexity, then Andrew mentioned a word we hadn't, I think, mentioned this today, which is instrumentalism. And of course, you know, Larry Vannuti has written recently contra-instrumentalism, the whole and the whole idea of translation as a purely instrumental tool. And I would extend that to language, actually. You know, the whole idea of language as a purely instrumental tool is exactly what that idea of going against language indifference is about. Because the moment you think about it as purely instrumental, purely as a vehicle, purely as a pane of glass, again, transparent piece of glass, then you're in that very dangerous territory. So yeah, popularization is another form of translation, absolutely. André Lefebvre, in one of the most beautiful books I've ever read, it's from the 1990s, wrote beautifully about how popularization is very much part of translation. But that doesn't, you know, like all forms of translation, it needs that constant critical self-awareness there.
Thank you. I was, since there are no questions in the Q&A, I was just wondering if any of you wanted to share any further thoughts. We have a few more minutes until the end of our session. Emily, please. I think you're still muted.
I want to thank the last two speakers, Federico and Loredana, for giving us images and palpable reference to translators and their bodies, their placements, because I've been thinking a lot about this in relation to the discussion in the US about the Afghan translators and how much they're on the line. And of course, we see this in war zones everywhere, where the translator doubles as a stringer, as a media broker, as somebody who puts their body on the line in many different ways. And, you know, you can attribute all kinds of political interests in this. I mean, it's a livelihood. But it is also something that emphasizes the physical vulnerabilities, and there is this, in a sense, part of the larger climate precariat is the translational precariat. Part of the issue of environmental justice is the justicing operation. You know, it goes back to that incredible moment at the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, where it was a sort of landmark moment where Zulu entered into the record, the official record of testimony and reparations. So there's, I think, a lot to be said for remembering the figure of the translator, who it is at different times. And you have both emphasized the sort of situational nature of that. And then the other topic that seemed to come up in the last two talks, but I think all the way through, is this one of, first of all, translation indifferentism and the importance of a certain kind of strong poesis within language that is non-instrumentalizable. I would underscore that as another aspect of untranslatability, which is very much part of, say, native taxonomies for words and ways of phenomenologically orienting bodies. You know, it's a kind of, it's linked to poetic uses of language that are, you know, by Western standards, non-instrumentalist, and therefore they are very hard to account for in even building a cosmology from a non-Western point of view. So that would be a third point. And a final point would be that it seems to me that through the reference to artistic practices and aesthetic practices, or what Dilip Menon calls, you know, partisan aesthetics, there's a kind of important transmedial element. So the way I've been thinking about the limits of translation is also in terms of the link between linguistic translatability or untranslatability and transmedialities. And this is, of course, also important in terms of, you know, how we define a unit of translatability. This has become a very political issue because of neural machine translation, which goes right back to the field. That will increasingly become a technique for intercultural communication. So I'll stop there, but I think the whole question of translation as transmediality is another issue we've touched on.
Thank you, Federico.
Thank you. Just picking up the point that Emily was just making, which also goes back to Andrew's point. Translation perceived not only as an instrument, but something that happens instantaneously, that there's no pain in the process. Now, unfortunately, neural language, natural language processing and NL, machine translation systems of all kind have persuaded that among large language groups that is possible. You can translate stuff in 30 seconds. That persuasion has been transmitted to large international organizations that work with the remaining 6,870 languages that are not covered at all by machine translation systems. And so the instantaneous nature of technology is completely out of the window, when actually our translators didn't even have websites or Facebook pages that could be used to support them in their translation effort. So instantaneous is part of the asymmetry, I think, very much so. It's the asymmetry of tools, the asymmetry of seeing translation as instrumental. And just one finishing point, going back to Antonia's question about where is the budget for these translations. We asked that questions to a number of crisis managers of international organizations, large international organizations in the humanitarian sector. And the answer back was, who is responsible to ask for the budget? So there's even a step further. Not only there isn't a budget, but there isn't a perception that somebody should be at times responsible for sorting out their budget. And of course, this is a simplification, but it was very much the concern of a workshop that we had. How can we establish a language policy to work in international settings if we cannot find somebody responsible? And one of the crucial points actually was not lack of interest or commitment, but it is something that touches all of our activities. So we should therefore be all responsible, but because everybody is responsible, nobody is. And that was very telling for me. And thank you.
Thank you, Federico.
If I can very quickly say just a couple of things to that. One on the first point that Emily made on the embodied nature of translation and the body of the translation and of the translator, to remind everyone of the fantastic work that has been done by an advocacy group, which is Red T. And Red T have petitioned indeed the United Nations and a number of international organizations, NATO. As in my capacity as president of IATIS, I'm a signatory of a number of these letters, precisely about what happens, especially right now at the moment of withdrawal from areas of conflict, to these translators who are very much live beings. And so, yeah, Red T. The other is on this question of artificial intelligence, neural networks, and so on, which I see absolutely as the latest embodiment, and I'm sure it will not be the last one, of this dream of the universal language. Umberto Eco wrote a beautiful, fantastic book about that in the 90s, and actually it ends with the dream of Adam, and it ends with the gift of translation, which is actually, the gift to humanity is the gift of translation as opposed to the universal language. But it's another of those, it's what I was talking about when I'm saying, don't wish away translation. We don't want to sort of make it disappear. But the first thing that you get asked every time, I'm sure Federico knows this as much as me, is like, how can we just, make it disappear? Just make it go away so we don't have to think about it. And yeah, the point that Federico was making, the investment levels, the disparity in investment levels, when you look at artificial intelligence and translation between minoritized languages and the big five or whatever, it's unbelievable. And so it reiterates exactly like, as we know with other forms of artificial intelligence, see all the polemics about facial recognition and so on, it's not unbiased. And that's the other thing that people say, well, if we have an automatic translation, it will not be biased. It will be perfectly neutral. Ethically, we will do away with the bias of the translator. Well, no is the answer to that.
Thank you. speaking of people who probably have a responsibility, although they would rather not have it, I'm painfully aware of the fact that it's my responsibility to call this event to a close, although the discussion could continue. And I'm sure that the discussion will continue in some other form, hopefully, as we said earlier, in physical presence in London, or in Rome, or in London and Rome, or in many other places. For now, I'd just like to thank you all very much again for these wonderful and inspiring interventions. And I'd like to thank our hosts at the BSR, the virtual BSR again. This is the end of our series. I wish you all a very good summer, and I'm sure that the conversation will continue. Thank you.
Yes, thanks from me as well. And it's been a fantastic workshop seminar, which we could have spoken much more, and I hope we will in person in due course. Thanks to all, and to British School in Rome particularly for all the organisation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.